Today's video will be sponsored by Parade, so stay tuned to learn how you can get 50% off on some awesome Parade products.
It seems they're bisexual.
Brace yourselves. The area of penetration will no doubt be sensitive.
Push hard. Dig it in there, Mr.
Let's kick off my big Pride Month video with a game. This game is called Name the Gay Media. I will summarize a story for you without any character names, any setting description specifics, anything that will give the story away. Instead, I'm going to describe the rough arc that the characters are going to go through, and then I will give you a second to guess what story it's from. We'll do a couple of these before we segue into our main topic. Ready? Let's start off easy. Story 1. We follow a boy approaching manhood. He has a close group of friends, but he feels somewhat alienated from them due to the secret that he's been keeping about himself. Through an anonymous letter, he meets another person who's going through the same difficult process, and the two eventually start to develop feelings for one another, even though they're not quite sure who the other one is. This book is a popular one, and I'm sure you guys knew that I'd use it. This is the book Simon vs. the Homo Sapiens Agenda, later adapted into the movie Love, Simon, the book by my brilliant friend Becky. I love you, Becky. Read the book if you haven't. It's honestly great. I love it. Let's do another. Story 2. We follow two adult women who run a business together that serves younger people. One of the younger people they serve becomes angry at these two women, and for revenge, she decides to tell everyone that the two of them are in a relationship with each other. The setting of the story is such that it does not accept two women being in this type of relationship with each other, and as a result, the women's business faces horrific backlash as a result of the rumor. But as they try to pick up the broken pieces of their lives, they also ponder the feelings that they have inside that maybe could indicate some potential truth behind the rumors. All right, take a minute. This one I think might be a little harder. Go ahead and guess though. The answer is that this is the 1934 stage play The Children's Hour, which was later adapted into a film starring Audrey Hepburn in 1961. But the original play, written by Lillian Hellman, is known for sparking controversy about its queer themes, especially since it was a play that centered on a lesbian rumor that was stated within the text to be about a lesbian rumor. All right. Story 3. We follow a young man who is tormented by certain feelings that his culture and religion tell him are wrong. He spent most of his life suppressing these feelings, but after meeting another man who then becomes his best friend, these feelings become awakened even stronger. His father firmly disapproves, and so, in the interest of being accepted by society, he decides to enter a religious ritual designed to get rid of these feelings, especially the ones that he has toward his best friend. However, unsurprisingly, the antiquated religious ritual does not work, due in part to the fact that he can't deny the feelings that he has. He realizes he can't change who he is deep down, and instead returns back to his friends, including the friend who sparked these original undesired feelings. Upon returning to being with his best friend again, he locks hands with him, stares into his eyes, and whispers, "I should have known." And forever after, he takes pride in who he is. Lock in your answers. Ready? This story is called Star Trek the Original Series, and also Star Trek the Motion Picture, and that is a description of, throughout the full arc of the show and the first movie, the arc experienced by our beloved Vulcan friend Spock. So grab a drink, grab a snack, we are in for a wild ride today, friends. It is Pride Month, so I figured in the spirit of Pride, let's do a queer literary analysis. Let's discuss the gayest piece of media ever, Star Trek. I mean, that was hyperbole. The title of gayest piece of media ever will always be up for grabs. You're all entitled to your own opinions on whatever you personally think it is. But to me, Star Trek will always be a queer masterpiece, a long-term staple in LGBTQ culture. And while I know that some of the newer Star Trek shows, those released after the turn of the century, some of those have more direct queer themes and discussions, the kind of stuff that older shows couldn't really show on air due to the social climate of the time. So I decided I'm not going to focus on those newer shows. Today, I'm going to do a video essay that I've been thinking about doing since before I even had a YouTube channel, since before shows like Discovery or Strange New Worlds even began. But I do want to give a quick shout out to my favorite Star Trek bisexual badass, Mariner from Lower Decks. I love you, girl. But that's just to say, this is an idea that's been kicking around in my head for the better part of a decade, and I've always just thought, hey, you know, one day, if I happen to just have a YouTube channel where people want to watch because they care about my analysis of media, I probably will have to eventually make a video essay about why Star Trek the original series was canonically gay. Well, somehow that happened, so here we are, let's go. I'm going to focus the scope of this essay on Star Trek properties released between 1966 and 1979, maybe 1984 if we're feeling feisty. You know, back when we weren't really allowed to have gays on television, back when season 3 of Star Trek made the headlines for airing one of the first interracial kisses on American television just a year after the Supreme Court declared interracial marriage legal throughout the country. Back when the show was doing plots filled with Vietnam War allegories while the Vietnam War was still actively happening, and plots that directly referenced World War II only 2 decades after said war even ended. Star Trek has always been a progressive show, and today, I'm here to explain how it's also always been gay. Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Savvy, and this is Savvy Writes Books, where today we are going to do a long, in-depth literary analysis of the queer themes and gay romantic subplot of Star Trek, the original series, the gayest show of the 1960s. But first, I want to thank my Patreon supporters. Check them out linked in the description below. Also, if you like the stuff I'm talking about today, if you like queer themes and Star Trek, you can check out my novel 90s Kids, which is a lesbian time travel story, and one of the main characters is a huge Star Trek fan, so jam-packed with Star Trek references. As we know, it's Pride Month, and I'm all about wearing bright, fun colors all month long. I have a couple different fun, bright outfits I'm gonna wear in this video, but while I show this one off right now, I thought maybe I'd also show off this cute bra I'm wearing underneath. Guess what, friends? Today's video is sponsored by Parade, a brand of bras, underwear, and loungewear that makes super comfortable, affordably priced bras in a range of sizes with an additional sizing scale for those of us with larger chests. Here I am wearing the Replay Scoop bralette in the color Milkshake. I chose this bra because not only could I tell it would have great support, which I need with how much I'm always moving around, but also because the color scheme reminded me of Barbie, so when I'm wearing this and working out, I can feel like Barbell Barbie, which has always been my goal, honestly. And here I am wearing the Luxe Longline Balconette bra in the color 8-Ball. This is actually my first balconette style bra ever, and I love it. The glow satin material is so soft and so comfortable, and the shape and style makes me feel like I have old school Hollywood vibes while I wear this. My favorite design of the bunch is the Sweetheart Satin Longline Bralette in the style Mood Board, which is such a fun print. It's made of a soft, comfy material, it fits perfectly, and the print, which includes flowers, butterflies, smiley faces, and more, it's so happy and fun, and I'm honestly just so excited that I now have a go-to online shop where I can get bras in a diverse range of exciting prints and colors for affordable prices, so I can regularly change it up. If you're interested in trying some of Parade's products for yourself, head to the link in my description below, yourparade.com/rights50, where you can get 50% off site-wide, excluding special sale products, when you use my code rights50. I honestly think these bras are just so incredibly comfortable, and I love how stylish they are in the variety of colors, cuts, and sizes they come in, so I really hope that you enjoy them as well. If you want to try out Parade, don't forget, the best way to do it is to use the link in my description. Parade's summer sale is their biggest sale of the year, and with my code rights50, you can get 50% off of your order, making it the perfect time right now to stock up or try some new items. Thank you so much to Parade for sponsoring today's video. Now, let's head deeper into our analysis. My thesis. So, first things first, what is my thesis? Am I here to argue that Star Trek, the original series, featured explicit gay love that says, I'm gay, I'm homosexual, and showed same-sex characters mashing their mouths together on screen in 1967? No, everybody knows that didn't happen. It was impossible. Star Trek began running before we repealed the Hays Code, which didn't allow for positive portrayals of same-sex couples on TV, and the Hays Code ended in 1968. And even though it ended in 1968, about 2 years into Star Trek's run, that didn't mean that right after we immediately unleashed explicit gayness and morally complex protagonists on our audiences. That was still risky, and at the end of the day, TV shows and movies are funded by companies who want to make money. So no, basically no one showed two characters of the same gender kissing with their mouths. And I am specifying with their mouths because later in this video I am going to argue that Kirk and Spock have explicitly kissed on screen, just not with their mouths, so stay tuned for that, nerds, okay? But yeah, we did not have that in 1960s television or 1970s television. It was even extremely controversial for Ellen DeGeneres to come out as a lesbian on her sitcom Ellen all the way back in the 90s. So obviously I'm not about to reveal that there is a secret Star Trek scene hidden in a vault somewhere that's been locked away for 60 years and somehow I know about it and you don't. Now, am I here to argue that Star Trek the original series had meaning to LGBTQ fans? I mean, yeah, that's true. I do agree with that, but that's not my thesis because that's obvious. We already know that Kirk and Spock were fucking in the fanfiction. I mean, most of us know that. If you spent 5 seconds in any nerdy internet community, you probably know that. Or even if you haven't, honestly, I think the earliest piece of literature that portrayed Kirk and Spock banging each other was published long before the internet. Most Star Trek scholars point to the first of these stories being A Fragment Out of Time by Diane Merchant, which was published in a zine called Grupp back in 1974. So my point is, yeah, most of us already know that they're gay in the fanfiction, and even that Kirk and Spock were potentially the birth of the modern day shipping culture. I highly recommend that everyone watch Jesse Gender's video from 3 years ago called How Slash Fiction Saved Star Trek if you want more info on that. I'll also reference that video a little bit more later in this video. But that's all to say that I'm not here to argue those things. Those things are givens. Those things have been proven. Those things have been documented historically. Today, I am here to argue the following thesis. Within Star Trek itself, the story portrayed in the TV show and the movies, and maybe we'll consult a few books too, the properties released between 1966 and 1984, Captain Kirk and his first officer, Commander Spock, had a romantic subplot that ended in the formation of a same-gender relationship with one another, and that the literary themes and character arcs found within Star Trek make a lot more sense and have a much stronger impact if you understand that. Basically, today I'm here to prove to you that yes, Kirk and Spock were gay. Canonically. I want to make something very clear though before we move forward. In this video, yes, I'm going to argue that Captain Kirk and First Officer Spock were in gay love with each other canonically within Star Trek itself, not the fanfiction. Whenever someone tries to argue this, the usual response I see them getting from someone who disagrees is, oh my god, why does everything have to be gay? Isn't it sexist to think that two men can't be close and have strong emotional bonds with each other without it being gay? Why does it have to be romantic? Can't men have platonic bonds too? Isn't it fostering toxic masculinity to claim that every time men show each other emotion that it has to be more than friendship? And my answer to that would be, sure, I agree. I'm not arguing against that. I'm not arguing that every time men show each other emotions that it's gay. I've never argued that. I am arguing that these two characters specifically are in love. That would be like if I start talking to you about my favorite lesbians in the WNBA and someone's like, oh my god, stop stereotyping women. Just because they're professional athletes doesn't mean they have to be gay. Holy non sequitur, Batman. You're not wrong. I never once argued otherwise. I was just at that moment talking about the lesbians in the WNBA specifically, okay? But just in case you need some extra assurance that I also love and value platonic male friendships, here is a brief list of some of my favorite platonic male fictional bonds, and just for the sake of the argument, let's focus only on ones that happen in Star Trek itself, okay? Kirk and McCoy, Data and Geordi, Picard and Riker, Jake and Nog. And there's tons more too, right? I'm not here to argue that male friendships are inherently gay. That would be stupid. Yes, many straight men in real life and in fiction can and should have close emotional bonds with each other. And also, at the same time, LGBTQ people also exist in the real world and also in fiction. I'm here to argue that these two in particular are in a gay relationship, or at the very least, you know, them being fictional characters and all, that their character arcs and story progression makes the most sense as a whole when you see that in the media. So what do I mean when I say canonically? Whoo boy, we've got a lot to discuss. We gotta get philosophical. Let's go. What is canon? A philosophical discussion. So what's really magical about Star Trek is that through the decades-long debate regarding whether Kirk and Spock were queer or not, that debate has called into question what it means to consume fiction. We have to get really philosophical before we can frame even how we're going to begin discussing this, because at the end of the day, the discussion kind of comes down to how we as humans, as the only currently existing storytelling species on this earth, how we communicate and interpret fictional concepts with one another. What it means to suspend our disbelief, what it means to analyze media and literature, what it means to read or hear words versus what it means to fully comprehend them. Am I overreacting? No, I genuinely don't think I am. All right, let's get into the big question. What does canon mean? What does it mean for something in a fictional world to be canonical? So if someone refers to the literary canon, they're talking about the works works of fiction that have stood the test of time, that are influential enough on human beings and society as a whole to be regarded among the classics. That's things like Shakespeare. And of course, the literary canon is constantly evolving and changing. It's always under scrutiny and debate as to how someone determines whether a work is important enough to be part of a canon, and who among us even has the authority to make that kind of distinction in the first place. From that concept of the literary canon, we can hone in on a smaller, more specific in scope concept of each individual piece of fiction's own canon. If we look at Merriam-Webster dictionary, this particular meaning of canon likely comes from a few different pieces of the definition put together. The authentic works of a writer, a sanctioned or accepted group of body or related works, an accepted principle or rule, a body of principles, rules, standards, and norms. So when we put that all together, we get what within a piece of fiction is authoritatively and definitively true within that fictional universe. For example, does the Starship Enterprise exist? In real life, in the world we're in right now, where I'm sitting, no. It is a fictional vessel, but within the fictional universe of Star Trek, to the characters we are watching, to those characters, yes, it does exist, because the Enterprise is a canonical piece of the Star Trek universe. Is Kermit the Frog real? I mean, no, not in the real world, but if we were transported into the Muppetverse, yeah, Kermit the Frog would be real, as he's real to the Muppets in the fictional world. Now, if we were transported onto the Starship Enterprise and we existed in the Star Trek universe, would Kermit the Frog exist? No. Kermit the Frog is not a canonical part of the Star Trek universe as he is within the Muppet universe. If I wrote a Star Trek and Muppets crossover fanfiction where Kermit boards the Enterprise, is Kermit now a part of the Star Trek universe? Not canonically, because that only exists within my specific fanfiction. If you were to go back and rewatch all of Star Trek and watch the Muppets movies, they as a whole would still remain separate, and my fanfiction would be the outlier. But this is where it all gets a little complicated, okay? And you're gonna have to bear with me. What if tomorrow, a big company like Paramount or ABC or something suddenly bought all the rights to every Muppets movie and all Star Trek properties, and they decided they wanted to make a movie called Star Trek with Muppets, in which Kermit commands the Enterprise? Is that canon? Within its own universe of the movie, of that specific movie, yes, it's canon. Is it canon within the original Star Trek universe? No. But what if this theoretical movie were to be set 200 years after the end of Voyager at a time period that Star Trek has not yet covered, and then claim that, like, for example, in the 27th century, the Muppets will then join Starfleet, and the entire movie contained references to things that already did happen in Star Trek, the original series, and the Next Generation and such. Is it now canon? I don't know. There comes a point where universes get too big and too complex for canon to be completely black and white. And Star Trek is one of the biggest examples of a property that's way too big to have one definitive canon. In 2009, J.J. Abrams directed a movie called Star Trek. Are the movies by J.J. Abrams canon? I'd argue no, but I'm biased because I hate them. Some who enjoy those movies would argue that yes, they're canon, they're just in a different timeline that diverges from the original Star Trek. Like the timeline split before the events of Star Trek, the original series. But this theory still comes with the understanding that the universe would have split in the 23rd century either way, to which I must ask, if that is the case, why is Khan white? Benedict Cumberbatch playing Khan in the Abrams universe abominations just completely disproves that they're canon. But Savvy, what if an entirely different sequence of events took place that caused Khan to be born white in the 23rd century? That's impossible, because Khan Noonien Singh within the original series was canonically born in 1959. Then during the eugenics wars of the 1990s, Khan was frozen and he wasn't awoken until the 23rd century, which happens in the original series season 1 episode Space Seed. What possible timeline divergence could have happened in the 2300s to cause a man of color frozen in the 1990s to wake up white and British, and even more than that, to not notice or care that it happened? The answer is that he didn't. J.J. Abrams is a hack who can suck my cock. His only good movie was Super 8. Stop letting that man write scripts for existing properties. Disclaimer, if you enjoyed the J.J. Abrams movies, you do you, okay? I get very passionate about my Star Trek opinions. If you hold different ones, we can still be friends. I'm just being dramatic because I'm a YouTuber, alright? I also feel like it's kind of insulting that we're supposed to treat a set of movies as Star Trek canon when they were written and directed by a guy who publicly admitted he didn't even like Star Trek, who a lot of us think was probably just making a demo reel to impress Disney so they give him Star Wars. Like, how is that more canon than a Kirk Spock /fic from 1974? If J.J. Abrams can make unrelated Star Trek movies and call them canon, just canon in a different universe, then isn't every single piece of fanfiction on AO3 or published in a fanzine also canon, just canon in a separate timeline? The answer is that canon is an abstract concept, not a hard rule. Canon is roughly whatever the majority of people accept. It's about the broader cultural understanding rather than a hard set of rules. So at the end of the day, what is canon has to come from a strange mix of creator intention and consumer interpretation. fiction. But what exactly is the ratio that we need to look at? And that's what we're going to figure out in our next section. So let's start with the audience interpretation piece of the equation. How do Star Trek's audiences interpret the original series? Early queer interpretations of Star Trek. Nowadays, within a lot of fandoms, we have this shipping culture. The concept of shipping characters is pretty normal. When we see two characters that we think would be cute together, we ship them. Usually the text has some evidence to support our reasoning, but not always. People creating gay ships and slash fiction is fairly commonplace for most fictional universes at this point, especially ones that have a lot of in-depth world building. But do you know when shipping culture did not exist? In the 1960s. Do you know when it began? In the 1970s. The entire phenomenon of shipping characters in the communities that formed around writing gay interpretations of fanfiction only began because of Star Trek. And I need to emphasize this. In the 1960s, at the time, Star Trek wasn't considered that popular of a show. It didn't really have a huge fan base, but the fans that it did have were super nerds who were extremely devoted to the show. Nowadays, many millennial and Gen Z viewers of TV and movies find it very easy to think in terms of shipping characters because we've seen it in online communities around us so often. But in the 1960s, there was no such culture, no such assumption. The majority of people did not interpret media in this way. Until Star Trek. Star Trek was just so overwhelmingly gay that it caused fans to build shipping culture from the ground up. Star Trek fans were the ones who invented the entire genre of slash fiction from scratch because something within Star Trek just inspired them. Jessie Gender talks about the history behind Star Trek fanfiction communities in her video How Slash Fiction Saved Star Trek, and I highly recommend watching it because it's fantastic. But here's just a little snippet of what I think is important here.
Many women fans started writing their own thoughts and ideas and fan fiction. But this was before the internet, meaning no easy way for fans to connect or meet. That is, until Deborah Langsham and Sherna Comerford. Deborah and Sherna were two friends who became enthralled with Star Trek and Spock in particular. Soon, Deborah and Sherna were put in touch with one Juanita Colson, another Star Trek fan who had been doing other science fiction fanzines, smaller amateur fiction magazines for local science fiction societies and clubs.
It's the perfect recipe for a great love story. You have two radically different people from millions of miles apart whose lives fit together perfectly.
It's a matter of who is looking at it, from what perspective. And from the perspective of gay people, seeing that is eye-opening. They see the gay passion, the gay attraction, and the gay anguish depicted in those scenes.
When Star Trek was canceled in 1969, there was no more official Star Trek media being produced. And without Netflix, where people could go back and binge watch their favorite shows that had been canceled, the only thing people had at the time was fiction and fanzines written by other fans. And Star Trek fanzines exploded. Dozens upon dozens of fans created these zines, and they began to pop up all over, keeping the Star Trek fandom alive and well. And Kirk/Spock fiction was front and center in many of it. Gene Roddenberry utilized Spockinalia and the other fanzines as examples of the show's popularity, eventually convincing the studio that Star Trek deserved a return to the screens.
We had Paramount pretty well convinced that fanzines are the lifeblood of the movement, and they always have been.
Most of these fanzines that he is offering for sale are KS, which means Kirk/Spock. In other words, love does not need to be heterosexual to be love.
This fan-driven culture, especially one that pushed queer interpretations of Star Trek, went on to inspire academics to begin looking at media analysis and consumption in a new way. It inspired multiple papers to be published in academic journals, such as Star Trek Rerun, Reread, Rewritten, Fan Writing as Textual Poaching by Dr. Henry Jenkins, published in Critical Studies in Mass Communication in 1988. We love Henry Jenkins because he was one of the professors back in the 90s who knew that video games did not cause violence and was willing to take on Jack Thompson's grifter ass about that. He's also considered a pretty big deal as a long-time media studies professor and academic. We also have things like Decoding Desire from Kirk and Spock to K/S by Elizabeth Woolidge, published in Social Semiotics in 2005, and papers like The Final Frontier is Queer by P.J. Falzone, published in Western Folklore also in 2005. And even beyond the academic publications, journalists throughout the decades have written about this phenomenon, specifically within Star Trek and how it defined queer culture. As esteemed queer publications publication The Advocate explained back in 2016, the parallels between Spock and a queer person are many. As the only alien in the crew of the original starship USS Enterprise, he was physically and emotionally different from his peers. Due to his biology, his sexuality was also repressed, and thus the heterosexual relationships he observed also came off as alien. He's the original outsider, confirmed Dan Devey, an entertainment journalist and Star Trek expert. Considering how it was the aim of creator Gene Roddenberry to create an inclusive universe where everyone is accepted and everyone is equal and everyone gets along, Devey could easily see how LGBT viewers of the original series were seeing ourselves reflected in him. For decades, the absence of LGBT characters has made these projections inevitable. As nerdy news site The Mary Sue stated back in 2015, the modern understanding of queerness and fandom, in all its myriad forms and complexities, owes the lion's share of thanks to James T. Kirk and Spock. They were the genesis of the phrase slash fiction, that's romantic fanfic between same-gendered characters, were featured in zines that formed the basis of modern communal fanfiction and fan art sharing, and were some of the only intimately close male characters not to get paired off with paper-thin female love interests out of panic. Though, of course, the last one might have been because Star Trek creator Gene Roddenberry was fully on board with implying that they were queer. And I think that last sentence is a good segue into our next section. We just covered the fan responses and interpretations of Star Trek, but we know that the fan interpretation isn't the only piece of the puzzle when it comes to determining whether something is canon within its own fictional universe. We also have to consider the creator's intentions, even if those intentions may be complex and occasionally paradoxical. So let's move into our next section. Life and death of the author. As we've established, each piece of fiction has its own universe with its own rules and events that happen in story called the canon. Fans of a story may then make their own fanfiction, fan art, fan videos, etc. based on altering said universes into something new. These things are not canonical to the original universe, but exist as separate entities. We've also established that even within an original fictional property itself, what is and isn't canon can still be up for debate due to inherent flaws and paradoxes that arise through the nature of creating any piece of media. So at the end of the day, who decides what is officially canon and what isn't? Is it the media's creators or consumers? Well, in order to determine that, once again, we have to ponder the various theories behind media analysis. In 1967, French philosopher Roland Barthes wrote a famous and often cited essay called The Death of the Author, which argued that once a piece of fiction has been read or watched or consumed in any way, the author loses the complete control that they once had over the universe in full. An author or a creator will do whatever they can to convey the messages that they want to in their work, but at the end of the day, communication has two parties, the speaker and the listener, and if the listener interprets something different from what the speaker intended, then the speaker may have failed to communicate. In a piece of fiction, if readers gather different meaning than the author intended, does that mean the piece of media failed, or does it mean that the true canon of media must be a collaborative mishmash of author intent and reader interpretation? According to the wonderful website TV Tropes, Death of the Author holds that the author's intentions and biographical facts, politics, religion, etc. should hold no special weight in determining an interpretation of their writing. This is usually understood as meaning that a writer's views about their own work are no more or less valid than the interpretations of any given reader. Intentions are one thing, what was actually accomplished might be something very different. The logic behind the concept is very simple. Books are meant to be read, not written, so the ways readers interpret them are as important and real as the author's intention. On the flip side, a lot of authors are unavailable or unwilling to comment on their intentions, and even when they are, they don't always make choices for reasons that make sense or are easily explainable to others. I guess it's kind of like the saying, the customer is always right, but it's also a lot more complicated than that. What's canon comes from some mixture of creator intention and consumer interpretation. There's a combination of both that reflects true understanding. So it's now time to break down Star Trek's creator intentions. What was the intention when originally creating Star Trek? Are the characters gay or not? Unsurprisingly, there is not one answer to that. Like all TV shows and movies, Star Trek was made by a ton of different people. Writers, producers, camera operators, actors, editors, you name it. So it's a little more complicated than looking at like a book written by one person, especially because due to the nature of episodic television at the time, the original series didn't have one consistent vision and one consistent characterization for every character. When it comes to what the people involved in making Star Trek have said about this particular topic, there are some writers implying that they could be gay, other writers saying, nah, I didn't intend for that. Most writers didn't speak on it either way. So let's look at the helm of all Star Trek production, the series creator Gene Roddenberry. What did he have to say about this? Surprisingly, he had a lot to say, but unsurprisingly, he also had very little to say. By which I mean, the dude took the position of Schrodinger's gay on this. Every answer he gave to this question was both yes and no. I'll give a bunch of examples of this throughout the video, but you'll see what I mean. It's almost almost magical how he managed to speak on the matter in a way that could be interpreted both ways depending on which preconceived notion you went into the conversation with. I don't know if he had a PR guy helping him or something, but this was just a brilliant way of figuring out how to word these things. I read many Star Trek debates on the internet, and you'd be shocked at how many people use the exact same quotes as both definitive proof that they both were and were not gay. So, here is probably the biggest example of that. Interviewers Sandra Marshak and Myrna Culbreath, who were also authors of the Star Trek novel The Price of the Phoenix, which I haven't read in years, but if I'm remembering, I think it's the book where Kirk proposes a three-way with Spock and the female Romulan commander. Am I thinking of the right thing? Anyway, I haven't read the book in a while, but the authors of this book were the interviewer, and the interviewers asked, "There's a great deal of writing in the Star Trek movement now which compares the relationship between Alexander and Hephaestion to the relationship between Kirk and Spock, focusing on the closeness of the friendship, the feeling that they would die for one another." And to that, Gene Roddenberry answered, "Yes, there's certainly some of that, certainly with love overtones. Deep love. The only difference being the Greek ideal. We never suggested in the series physical love between the two, but we certainly had the feeling that the affection was sufficient for that, if that were the particular style of the 23rd century. This is the most fun part of this whole thing for me as a writer and book reviewer, so let's break down the language. If you were like, no, they're not gay, you probably looked at this statement and thought, yeah, he says it right there. We never suggested physical love between the two. He said it right there. They didn't bang. Side note, I wouldn't necessarily argue with this. I wouldn't argue that during the original series that they ever banged. I'd argue that happened for the first time probably around the end of the motion picture, somewhere before The Wrath of Khan. And Roddenberry said this quote to the interviewers in preparation for William Shatner's biography, which was published in 1979, the same year the movie came out, meaning that this interview happened long before Star Trek the Motion Picture ever hit the big screen. So the quote itself doesn't refer to any physical love that could have happened in the movies, as the movies weren't out yet. So I'd personally argue that the motion picture is where they have their first kiss. It makes the most sense narratively if we look at the structure and pacing of the arc as a whole, but we'll get there. Regardless, whether or not you think they're gay, if you think no, you probably were like, look, he said right there, he did not put intentional sexual love into the series. But if you already thought that they were gay, you probably read this quote the other way. You were probably like, dude, he literally just said he intended for deep love between them, and he said that there wasn't any physical sexual love portrayed on screen in the series, but, quote, he had the feeling that the affection was sufficient for that, if that were the particular style of the 23rd century. Bro said if being gay is acceptable by the time we get to the 2200s, they could be, because their relationship was certainly strong enough for it, and here we are in 2024, and being gay on TV is already way more acceptable than it was in the 1970s, so I think we can take that as a yes, maybe. So, was Gene Roddenberry on board with them being gay or not? We will literally never know, because, as I'll point out in the next section of this video where we're going to break down Star Trek episodes, books, and movies, most of Roddenberry's own writing addressing this topic is worded exactly like this, and can be read both ways, and has been used as definitive proof by both sides. He continues to do this even when unprompted, and I think he just enjoyed fucking with us, right? Like, I can't read his mind, but this has to be intentional. And that would make sense, because if he's being asked this question, he can't really commit one way or the other. Imagine if he were to be like, yes, they're gay, they're super gay and in love. What happens then? Well, it's the 1970s. Star Trek has already gone through cancellations, and only through the power of fan persistence is it still surviving. If there's any hope of the show entering syndication or getting a sequel show, like, I don't know, something called The Next Generation, maybe the creator of said show would do well not to piss off the overwhelmingly homophobic American public, especially those working in the media, because remember, we're still less than a decade post-Hays Code, and many of the same people are still working in media production. So obviously he couldn't say that, but imagine he said, no, they're not gay. They're just bros, nothing more. Sure, Hollywood bigwigs may have liked that answer, but Hollywood bigwigs weren't what was keeping Star Trek afloat. The show originally kind of flopped. The success of Star Trek was due to its rabid fan base, and many of the most passionate members of said fan base were women who wrote fan fiction, LGBTQ people who saw themselves reflected in these characters, and also the cross-section of us who are both women and LGBTQ people. So, do you piss off the media or your most devoted fans? Neither. You answer like a goddamn politician. But this is a good segue, because we should talk a little more about the Greek comparison here, the parallels drawn to Alexander and Hephaestion. It's Pride Month, so I must ask you all, who is the world's most influential bisexual? Who is the most famous bisexual person of all time? Normally, I like to answer this by saying it's Freddie Mercury, but that's just because I really like him. If we're being truly honest with ourselves about the greater trajectory of human history, the answer is actually probably Alexander the Great, the ancient Greek warrior, king, leader, you name it, student of Aristotle, founder of the city of Alexandria. The dude was important, okay? And also, according to the surviving art of that period, he was kind of hot. And he's suspected to have been bisexual, although back in ancient Greece that wasn't really that outside the norm. He was married 3 times to different women, and at the very least sources claim that he was very in love with his first wife, Roxana, and I say speculate because this was a really long time ago, I'm talking thousands of years ago, so I'm doing my best with the information that I can read. But in addition to his love affairs with women, Alexander is known for also being speculated to have had a long-term affair with his best bro, Hephaestion, just a little bro job, just guys being dudes. As National Geographic's article from this past February explains, sexual relationships between men were common among elites in ancient Macedonia. Alexander likely participated in the martially driven bisexual culture of the Macedonian court, according to historian Daniel Ogden. Ancient writers didn't conclusively identify Alexander and Hephaestion as lovers. Due to this lack of certainty, modern scholars hesitate to precisely define Alexander and Hephaestion's relationship. Nonetheless, many conclude that they may have been lovers. This Alexander the Great dude, he really sounds pretty great. I'd love to see more about him. Like, I wonder if there's ever been a movie made about Alexander the Great. Wouldn't that be cool? Just kidding. I don't wonder. There has been a movie. It's called Alexander the Great. It was made in 1963, a few years before casting for Star Trek would have begun. I wonder if anyone who had anything to do with Star Trek worked on this movie. It would be really funny if, like, someone who was really involved with Star Trek worked on— Oh, there it is. Alexander the Great was played by none other than William Shatner, Captain Kirk himself. But does that have to mean anything? Just because William Shatner played Alexander the Great doesn't mean there's any relevance to Star Trek, right? I mean, ancient Greece was way in the past, Star Trek is way in the future. They're completely unrelated to one another, right? I mean, I guess that would be true if Star Trek's writing and direction weren't confirmed to be heavily influenced by Greek mythology and ancient Greek and Roman cultures. And it's not like the people working on Star Trek never saw Alexander the Great. According to Marshak and Culbreth, the 2 writers who were conducting the interview where we got that weirdly vague quote from Roddenberry, one of the reasons Roddenberry had his eye on William Shatner for the role of Captain Kirk was due to his performance as Alexander the Great. Star Trek itself, the original series in particular, is filled with ancient Greek symbolism and allusions. The 2nd season episode, Who Mourns for Adonais, even confirms that Greek gods truly do canonically exist within the Star Trek universe. And by exist, I don't mean they exist as literal deities, they exist as aliens, like those that the Greeks knew as Zeus and Apollo and the like, came from a race of aliens that visited the Mediterranean region of Earth thousands of years ago and influenced life, but human civilizations changed over time in a way that caused humans to stop wanting to worship these alien beings, so then they left Earth alone. So in a way, there's like a really early first contact that we just don't talk about. In addition, season 2 has the episode Bread and Circuses, which features a planet modeled after the civilization found in ancient Rome, and the season 3 episode Plato's Stepchildren features an alien race called Platonians who have modeled their society after ancient Greece and named themselves after the philosopher Plato. All of this is to say that plenty of the creators behind Star Trek were familiar with ancient Greek mythology as well as ancient Greek and Roman societies and how they would have functioned historically. Plus, if we're looking at the parallels in a literary sense, it's there. The symbolism is there. Your high school English teacher should be foaming at the mouth right now. Star Trek, a show that has long included intentional ancient Greek references, allusions, and allegories, starred a guy who was cast in part due to his performance as Alexander the Great. The actor in Star Trek is playing a captain, just like how Alexander led an army, and we know that Starfleet is an organization that draws heavily from parallels to historical military structures, but with an outlook on the future as one day we'll have military-like organizations that exist for exploration rather than for conquering. Regardless, you've got Alexander, a captain in his own way, who's remembered in the public consciousness for having been in love with a guy who served under him in this organization who was also his right-hand man. I'm saying, like, that's what we call a literary device. Beyond the hot bisexuals of the BC era, though, we can also draw parallels within Star Trek itself. We can't know for sure just how much Captain Kirk's character was inspired by Alexander the Great, but we can confirm with certainty that there's another character out there who was inspired by Captain Kirk, and that is Commander William Riker, first officer of the Enterprise in Star Trek The Next Generation. According to the Star Trek news site Red Shirts Always Die, when Star Trek The Next Generation was in production, the producers knew that they would need to draw in fans of the original series. Those fans had gotten used to a self-assured, handsome man with an almost magnetic attraction for ladies because of Captain James T. Kirk. So when Jonathan Frakes came on board for the role of Commander William T. Riker, they gave him the same confidence and attitude, but the producers wanted to take things a little further so that hopefully fans would make a connection. According to What Culture, that's why they gave Riker the same middle initial as Captain Kirk. He's William T. Riker, Kirk is James T. Kirk, they named him William, like William Shatner, and in the first season of The Next Generation, before they'd really nailed down Riker's permanent character, like back before he had the iconic sexy facial hair. He'd often behave a lot like Kirk, and I don't just mean in terms of being brawny and like the ladies' man, I also mean in terms of going on random philosophical rants and tangents in the middle of the episode, talking really slowly like William Shatner did, things like that. It's clear that Riker was really inspired by Kirk. Most of us already know that. Interestingly enough, though, much like Captain Kirk, Riker is also a known player, a ladies' man. He loves to get around, but in addition to his episodic one-off romances, he also has a series-long romantic arc with an officer below him on the Enterprise, an arc that concludes in the subsequent movies when they get married. And that is Counselor Deanna Troi. I love her. Deanna Troi has one Betazoid parent and one human parent, making her the only half-human, half-alien senior officer on the Enterprise. Coming from planet Beta Z, Troi is the daughter of Lwaxana, a Betazoid ambassador who occasionally appears on the Enterprise for Federation business. Visits from her Betazoid mother often make Deanna nervous about their relationship and dealing with her mother's expectations versus the choices she makes for herself. Because of her Betazoid heritage, Troi has empathic powers and is the only senior officer aboard the Enterprise with the ability to communicate telepathically with others. Are you ready for this? Spock has one Vulcan parent and one human parent, making him the only half-human, half-alien senior officer on the Enterprise. Coming from the planet Vulcan, Spock is the son of Sarek, a Vulcan ambassador who appears on the Enterprise for Federation business. Visits from his Vulcan father often make Spock nervous about their relationship and dealing with his father's expectations versus the choices he makes for himself. Because of his Vulcan heritage, Spock has telepathic powers and is the only senior officer aboard the Enterprise with the ability to communicate telepathically with others. Why did I get a master's degree in English if not to do this? Now, I know I said we can't talk about each individual Star Trek writer's intentions, but beyond Gene Roddenberry himself, we do need to talk about the intentions of one other writer. Theodore Sturgeon, who wrote the scripts for 2 Star Trek episodes, the Season 1 episode Shore Leave and the Season 2 episode Amok Time, both of which I will fully break down in our next section. What was really cool about Star Trek is that the episodes were often written by science fiction writers who write prose as well as scripts, and as a result, the show had the tone of short sci-fi stories that you would read that would pose these ethical quandaries. It wasn't just about being action scenes in space. It's why the show is so slow and so philosophical, why it relies so much on imagery from Greek mythology and Shakespeare and biblical allegories, other classics. One such well-known sci-fi writer was Mr. Theodore Sturgeon, known for his plethora of novels and short stories, as well as Sturgeon's Law, in which he is said to state that 90% of everything is crap. He was probably right. But what makes Theodore Sturgeon special is that he had kind of a bit of a reputation for putting gay shit in his stories. According to his Wikipedia page, Sturgeon published the first stories in science fiction that dealt with homosexuality: The World Well Lost, June 1953, Affair with the Green Monkey, May 1957, and sometimes put gay subtext in his work, such as the back rub scene in Shore Leave. Shore Leave being, of course, the 15th episode of the first season of Star Trek. Sturgeon's story, The World Well Lost, was considered fairly groundbreaking and somewhat controversial in 1953 for portraying a same-sex romance within a published sci-fi story, which was rejected multiple times for that reason before it was finally published in the June issue of the magazine Universe. And this story, I shit you not, this story is about 2 guys who go on a mission in space together, one who is the sexy captain that all the women love, the other a more reserved and thoughtful type. They have to return 2 aliens to their home planet. They're telepathic and seem to read the officer's mind and realize that he's in gay love with his captain, and which the story confirms is true. And then a decade later, they hired this guy to write for Star Trek. You know, a show whose 2 main characters were 2 guys who go on missions in space together. One who is the sexy captain all the women love, the other a more reserved and thoughtful type. They hired Theodore Sturgeon to write for 2 characters in pretty much the exact same setup, knowing full well that last time he had this plot, he made it gay. And they let him write the Vulcan mating episode. We'll get there, okay? But this is kind of what I'm talking about. Some Star Trek writers like D.C. Fontana, for example, have said, no, I did not intentionally put any gay stuff in there. Meanwhile, you've got other writers like Theodore Sturgeon, who treats space like the gay-ass Wild West, and then you've got Gene Roddenberry himself being like, are they gay? I don't know. What is gay? Is Schrodinger's cat alive or dead? Who knows anything? Do any of us truly exist? What does it even mean to be human? And so the debate continues on indefinitely. This debate has been going on for so long that there are kids out there watching Star Trek right now whose grandparents weren't even born yet when this debate first started. So now, with all of those discussions behind us, we are finally ready
to build the perfect pizza.
To dive into the canonical gay love story of Captain Kirk and Commander Spock as shown on screen in Star Trek: The Original Series series and its subsequent movies. Star Trek: The Arc of the Gay Romantic Subplot. Star Trek aired for the first time on TV on September 8th, 1966. That's my birthday. That was exactly to the day 26 years before I was born. On the day I turned 26, which was September 8th, 2018, I celebrated the fact that my birth was the exact midpoint between the moment we were currently experiencing and the beginning of Star Trek.
And you did it at my birthday dinner.
That's just a little anecdote. It doesn't have any relevance to the rest of the video. Let's get into our episode-by-episode breakdown. During this section, I'll reference some videos by other amazing creators who have covered this topic before, such as Alexander Avila, who posted an episode of his series Are They Gay? About Kirk and Spock now 8 years ago. And I also want to shout out a smaller 2000 sub channel called The Ship's Closet, which made an entire playlist of 22 videos about this 14 years ago. This was back when YouTube still made you break videos longer than 15 minutes into parts, so as a result there are a lot of videos. I wanted to give those creators a quick shout out and let you know that their videos on this topic are also excellent, and as always, sources are linked in the Google Doc below. Original Star Trek is a very episodic show. Next Generation is as well, and then Voyager and Deep Space Nine become more of a mix. The show is still episodic, but with some arcs continuing over multiple episodes and some permanent changes happening to characters that influence later episodes. Original series has the least of this. TV at the time was so much like, here's this week's episode, with the intent that the viewer could watch them in any order and still have roughly the same experience. As a result, character growth happens very slowly, with only a bit in each episode. But here are the overall character motivations and rough arcs that Captain Kirk and his buddy Spock will go through. Captain Kirk is the youngest captain in Starfleet to command the Enterprise. He's a guy who feels very strong impulses and emotions, but is also very intelligent and reflective, and as captain, he needs to square these qualities to keep his ship and his crew safe. He's extremely confident and loyal, but often finds himself in situations where his own values are put to the test. Can he safely complete a mission if it puts his crew's life in danger? Will his emotional loyalty to his close friends like Spock and McCoy cause him to act irrationally in ways that might not serve the mission the best? Can he do what he thinks is best for a new planet while also balancing Starfleet's prime directive? Those types of questions. Spock's arc is about learning to accept himself as both a logical and emotional being. Vulcan society is built on the glorification of facts and logic. They're all like,
facts don't care about your feelings.
If you ever put feelings above facts, you are failing as a Vulcan, and your people will view you as inferior. Vulcans can feel emotions, but are taught to suppress them in the name of keeping society more efficient, as well as reining in any battle impulses that they may have, considering Vulcans are supposed to possess superior strength to humans. During the course of the series, Spock regularly finds himself in situations that challenge his views about the superiority of logic to emotion. The arc that he completes throughout the series itself and the movies is one where he slowly learns that emotions do have their place, and that there are times when acknowledging and feeling his own emotions is more authentic than suppressing them. So as we go through these episodes, I'm not going to talk about every single one or talk about everything that happens in each plot. Rather, I'm going to stick to what's relevant, as in discussing places where these characters' arcs are developed and showing how those arcs fit best into the growing romantic subplot that pushes these arcs forward and motivates them. Season 1, Episode 4, called The Naked Time, gives some of the strongest character-motivated development in the show. It's at the point where we get both Kirk and Spock's yearning passage. That's what it's called in the art of novel writing. You have a section towards the beginning of the story where each character gives us their want or their need that's going to push their motivations forward, that will guide us through the rest of the story. So here's the premise. After Spock and a junior crewman visit a planet, they bring back with them a strange infection, some kind of substance or virus that's impacted them. Dr. McCoy can't find any physical proof of it, but the substance, which is contagious, has spread throughout the ship, lowering everyone's inhibitions, and it's making everybody drunk. Various crew members start acting weird now that they no longer have impulse control. It's the episode where we get shirtless Sulu running through the Enterprise halls with a sword, because why not? He's drunk. With lowered inhibitions, Spock can now freely express his emotions, and as a result, he starts crying about how difficult it is to always have to suppress his emotions.
My father, our customs. Jim, when I feel friendship for you, I'm ashamed.
So, are they in love? Well, it's the beginning of the 5-year mission. We're at the very start of the show, and like I said, the subplot isn't going to resolve itself until we're partway through the movies, so no, I wouldn't call this full-on romantic love just yet. Rather, I'd call it the start of said plot's development, the beginning of the will they, won't they. The story has just established that one character is having an internal background struggle with resolving his positive feelings toward the other character, feelings that are a new experience to him, that make suppressing emotions a painful and difficult experience, whereas previously it had been easier for him. Basically, it's an admission that the feelings Spock has for Captain Kirk are unlike other feelings he's experienced and successfully suppressed before. There's something stronger about this particular sensation, and he hasn't yet resolved what it is. Season 1, Episode 9, Dagger of the Mind, which is named after a line from Macbeth. Like I said, Star Trek was big on the literary allusion, so that makes me feel confident that I am doing the right thing by giving it this in-depth of a literary analysis of the show. In this episode, Kirk and his crew go to a planet that has a doctor who is said to have pioneered a psychiatric treatment for people undergoing mental illness, only to learn that this treatment actually just completely fucks up your brain. The episode is significant because it's an episode where we learn what Captain Kirk's definition of romantic love is. Alexander Avila explained this really beautifully in his video on this topic, so I'm going to insert a clip from him here, and again, highly recommend you check out the video.
In the Star Trek episode, Dagger of the Mind, character Dr. Adams says this to Kirk.
I'm madly in love with Helen, Captain. You'd lie, cheat, steal for her. Sacrifice your career, your reputation.
No, Doctor, no!
So that's how Star Trek defines love, eh? Someone you'd lie, cheat, steal for, sacrifice your entire career for.
The definition of being in love with someone is established to be a state where you'd make a variety of sacrifices for the other person. You'd lie, cheat, steal for them, sacrifice your career and your reputation for them. Captain Kirk is a character who is established to be loyal, honest, extremely devoted to his career. It would take a lot for him to meet this standard.
Love. You're better off without it, and I'm better off without mine. This vessel, I give. She takes. She won't permit me my life. I've got to live hers.
And there's an episode toward the end of season 1 called The City on the Edge of Forever, which was written by one of the sci-fi greats, Harlan Ellison, in which Kirk almost does this for a love interest. A woman he meets named Edith Keeler. He meets her while he's traveling back in time and she lives in the past. She's the closest he comes to meeting this level of sacrifice that the show establishes is required for love. But in the end, Kirk does choose to leave Edith behind for the sake of humanity as a whole. As we'll see later throughout the course of the show, it takes a lot for Kirk to make this level of sacrifice, and yet he will do every single one of these things. Lie, cheat, steal, sacrifice his career and reputation, even go so far as to let the Enterprise explode, to jeopardize his entire Starfleet career to save Spock. It's a setup and payoff. It's a theme stated, and then the events unfold to match that theme. It is a literary device. Season 1, Episode 15, Shore Leave, is the first episode written by confirmed gay ally Theodore Sturgeon. There's really only one scene in this episode that advances the romantic tension, but it's a pretty famous one.
Something wrong? A kink in my back. Push hard. Dig it in there, Mr. Thank you, Yeoman, that's sufficient.
Oh yeah! Dig it in there, Mr. Spock. In what universe is it normal for a captain to ask his first officer to rub his back? It's not. The yeoman was rubbing Kirk's back when he indicated he wanted a back rub, but Kirk thinks it's Spock rubbing his back, and that's what makes him moan. But then when he realizes it's someone else, he's disappointed and doesn't even want the back rub anymore. He was only enjoying the back rub because he thought Spock was giving it to him. Theodore Sturgeon wrote this one. Episode 16, the Galileo 7, is often pointed to as an example of Kirk and Spock's growing sexual tension with one another, and that's mostly from the way Kirk starts to show regular physical affection and lots of suggestive looks with some flirtatious teasing thrown in there. The context of this scene is that Spock has just returned to the Enterprise after saving the entire away team, and he saved them by making an impulsive, emotional choice rather than a logical one.
You mean you reasoned that it was time for an emotional outburst?
Wouldn't put it in exactly those terms, Captain, but those are essentially the facts.
You're not going to admit that for the first time in your life, you committed a purely human, emotional act?
No, sir.
Mr. Spock, you're a stubborn man.
Now, I'm not going to say that this particular episode brings about any massive pieces of romantic subplot development, but I will say that I can see why people point to this one. It's a scene where if most people had imagined Captain Kirk behaving this way around a woman, there would be no doubt in anyone's mind that it's meant to convey flirty intentions, and the dialogue does sound like it's straight out of a romance movie of this era. "Why, Mr. Spock, you are a stubborn man indeed," he says as he drapes his arm around his shoulder and inches his face closer as his eyes attempt to tease him. Remember, we're reading things through the language of storytelling, the language of film. There's limited stuff we can see on screen, and this is what we see. Episode 23, A Taste of Armageddon, is similar in that bits of romantic subplot development come in the episode's closing after the main mission of the day has been completed. Captain Kirk has successfully saved the day, and Spock is confused to how he did so by relying on his emotions rather than logic.
Feeling is not much to go on.
Sometimes a feeling, Mr. Spock, is all we humans have to go on.
Captain, you almost make me believe in luck.
Why, Mr. Spock? You almost make me believe in miracles.
Why, Mr. Spock, you almost make me believe in miracles, which once again sounds like something out of like a Harlequin romance of the era. That line's never explained. There's no other in-episode references to it. He's literally just flirting. There's nothing else to it. This is a common literary trope that we're going to see throughout Star Trek. Captain Kirk takes on the role of the traditionally masculine hero. If we're analyzing media through the language of storytelling, a shared language that we all have that relies on tropes, cultural references, a language that is built on a shared understanding of what certain cues mean within a story rather than how they play out in the real world, this scene is set up as romantic banter. Again, imagine Spock were a woman, as he's the masculine action hero's counterpart. If Kirk had said, "Why, Miss Something or Other, you almost make me believe in miracles," with that tone of voice, with that facial expression, audiences would rightfully read it as the captain flirting with his love interest, and a lot of audiences already read that way here too. Imagine this were Captain Picard telling Dr. Crusher, "Beverly, you almost make me believe in miracles." We'd be so excited that the Next Generation had finally returned to the Picard Crusher romantic subplot, the will they won't they story we'd all been following that Star Trek, didn't do the best job with. In real life, maybe we could read it differently, but in film we only see what's intentionally put there. What purpose does this line serve? But to advance the romantic subplot, from a literary perspective, not really anything. Devil in the Dark is the episode about the Horta. It's the one where Spock tries to mind meld with a sentient rock. Straight up kitschy goodness, this one, I love it. In this episode, we learn that while Spock presents himself as someone who must ignore all emotions on the outside, he is prone to giving into emotions when Captain Kirk is involved. Something about that Captain Kirk just makes Spock unable to control his emotions the way he usually can. So the crew is investigating the Horta, which they think is dangerous. Kirk's orders are to shoot to kill. This thing is nothing like they've ever encountered before. It's not safe to attempt interacting with it. It's already killed multiple crewmen, but Spock disagrees. He thinks it's valuable to keep the Horta alive because it's a new entity that they've never seen before, and from his perspective as a scientist, it needs to be studied for the greater understanding of the universe. Isn't that what they're in space for in the first place?
An effort to surround it, possibly capture it.
Your orders are shoot to kill. Protect yourself at all times. Capture it? I don't recall giving any such order.
I merely thought that if the opportunity arose...
I will lose no more men.
So, seems like a potential conflict between these two. Kirk refuses to let any more crew members be killed by the Horta, and Spock is stubborn that no, that is the wrong approach. Even though Spock has also just experienced the death of fellow crew members, he can't seem to muster up the emotional wherewithal to care about that. It's logical that they study the Horta, not to kill it. But what happens when it's Kirk who could be in danger?
I know exactly where the creature is.
Where, Captain?
10 feet away from me.
Kill it, Captain. Quickly.
Not making any threatening moves, Spock.
You don't dare take the chance, Captain.
I thought you were the one that wanted kept alive.
Your life is in danger. You can't take the risk.
Seems to be waiting.
I remind you, it is a proven killer.
Yeah, no more logic. Logic is out the window. It's killing everybody else. Still, logical to keep it alive for the sake of the universe, okay? Oh, but Captain, it's near you? It's not even threatening you, it's just in your general vicinity? Kill it! Kill it now! This is one of our first examples of Spock surrendering to emotions solely for Kirk, and it will continue on from here. So with that in mind, let's get into Season 2. Season 2 starts off with a bang! Literally, as in banging, sexually, because Season 2, Episode 1, Amok Time, is the gayest, horniest thing to ever grace the TV in 1967. We went from 0 to 100 with this episode, okay? I've seen this episode about 1 million times at this point, but it had been a couple years since I'd done a full original series rewatch, so when I was rewatching this episode before filming this video, I was shocked at how much this episode is really just pure smut. Like, there's barely any sci-fi concepts in this episode. All science fiction of this episode is uncharacteristically squishy in service of advancing the smut plot. Maybe it's because I've been reading so much shitty Colleen Hoover lately for the reviews that I've been posting on this channel, but when watching this episode the other day, I was weirdly surprised at how many contrived romance tropes were just stuffed into this episode, and I'm honestly kind of surprised that anyone was ever able to watch this episode without pausing to question if they accidentally put on a Star Trek porn parody by mistake. So here's the plot of Amok Time, okay? I am not kidding. Once every 7 years, Vulcans go through mating season. During this time, their bodies get so aggressively horny that if they don't mate, they will die within a week or so. They must mate. There is no way around it. In the time leading up to the consummation of their arranged marriages, the Vulcans become fully feral beings who cannot control their violent impulses. Then once they fuck, they're good to go for another 7 years. I mean, they can continue to fuck their spouse or whoever in the meantime, but they won't die if they don't. Spock has an arranged marriage waiting for him back on Vulcan. He doesn't ever really talk to his fiancée because he prefers just to be in space by himself, but he needs to mate with her or else he'll die. So he wants to head back to Vulcan to marry this girl that he hardly knows. We're gonna go full Darman here, okay? What happens next is shocking. You won't believe what happens next. This concept has never been mentioned before in the series, and it comes up as a reference a few times in later shows, but when you're watching the show in order, this concept is just jarring, okay? So we're in the erotica fetish universe where Vulcans are all feral doms. The plot of the episode is the fuck or die trope. Do you ever read a romance novel where they use a common trope like only one bed, but the circumstances surrounding the story are such that in real life there would definitely be 2 beds, and you know the situation isn't actually that plausible, but you understand that the author just really needed to get those characters into that situation for the sake of sexual tension? That's this episode. Nothing about it makes sense. The circumstances are so thoroughly contrived. If you were to ask, why did these characters make this weirdly uncharacteristic decision at every turn? The answer is because they needed to somehow get us to the scene where a painfully horny Spock is wrestling Captain Kirk in a torn shirt with his titties exposed in the sand. That's why. Take a moment and guess who wrote this episode. If you guess Theodore Sturgeon, you'd be right, Theodore Sturgeon, the king of mid-century gays in space, the one who'd already published a story about a space mission captain and his first officer hiding their gay love from telepathic aliens. He wrote this episode. Ready? Spock has his period and is being really cranky about it. Nobody on the ship understands why he's so angry all the time, when normally the dude never shows any emotions, especially not anger. Dr. McCoy examines Spock and can't figure out what's wrong with him, but that if he doesn't fix something soon, he's gonna die because his adrenaline is all over the fucking place. Spock refuses to tell anyone what he knows about his condition and instead insists that they change course to Vulcan, even though they're already on course for another mission. Eventually, after a long while of prodding, Captain Kirk is able to find out what's going on. Spock didn't want to talk about it because it's a secret Vulcan thing that humans and outsiders aren't supposed to know about, but he is going through Ponfar, which is the Vulcan mating season. Every 7 years, Vulcans go into heat, and they need to fuck or else they'll die. The reason he wants to go to Vulcan is because his parents have an arranged marriage waiting for him there, and he's supposed to marry this Vulcan woman, mate with her, and then he can go back to space and forget about his wife, because love isn't logical. Spock doesn't care about love. Alright, this is already a ridiculous premise, but it gets weirder. Kirk, Spock, and McCoy arrive on Vulcan for Spock's arranged marriage ceremony. The woman he's supposed to marry T'Pring calls Caliphie, which means she wants to challenge the marriage. She doesn't want to marry Spock, but Spock is so consumed by blood fever, meaning he's so horny his blood's now on fire, that he's just in the middle of a fever dream and has no clue what's happening. So T'Pau, the leader of all of this ritual going on Vulcan, she begins the challenge. See, Vulcans are logical most of the time, but they let all their emotions out during mating season. This is because before Vulcan Jesus Surak brought logical teachings to their planet back in ancient Vulcan times, Vulcans were feral beasts who killed one another in competition for their mates. So if a Vulcan chooses to challenge the arranged marriage, there has to be a fight to the death. If you're a romance or erotica reader, start typing all the extremely contrived tropes you're noticing in the comments below right now, okay? Spock's betrothed, T'Pring, says she chooses Captain Kirk to fight for her. So now Kirk has to fight Spock to the death. Why does Captain Kirk agree to this? Well, for one, T'Pau fails to mention it's a fight to the death until Kirk has already agreed, and Kirk acts weirdly out of character by being too stupid to ask for details about the fight, and two, Spock needs to mate or else he'll die of blood fever, so Kirk assumes he can just kind of fake it and let Spock win the fight. The first thing that happens during the fight is that Spock uses his weapon to rip Kirk's shirt open and expose his man titties. Does this fight seem oddly sexual to anyone else? Like, maybe this fight could theoretically take the place of the mating act itself? Stay tuned. So they continue fighting, which looks like this. Just whipping and choking each other in the sand while one character's shirt is open and the other is already established to currently be the horniest he's ever been in his life. Theodore Sturgeon wrote this. McCoy is watching from the sideline.
Oh my god. Time and place.
Noticing that Kirk is going to die if somebody doesn't intervene. So he convinces T'Pau to let Kirk have a special medicine that'll even the playing field for them since human bodies aren't accustomed to Vulcan air. McCoy gives Kirk the medicine, which is actually meant to knock him out to simulate death so they can fake it and end the fight early. So they continue fighting like this. And then suddenly Kirk dies. Spock wins the fight. He goes to T'Pring and is like, why did you do that? And she explains that she wants another Vulcan man and that Spock's always away in space, so she got a new boyfriend, and that she didn't choose the other Vulcan to fight Spock because that would mean there'd be a risk Spock could kill him, and she didn't want her actual boyfriend to die. So she chose Kirk because Kirk doesn't know her, so even if he won, he'd just go back to space and she could get with her boyfriend. But even if Spock won, I guess they'd fuck to cure the Ponfar or whatever, but then he'd go back to space anyway, so she could have her real boyfriend because he'd be mad at her for choosing the fight that he wouldn't really want to honor their marriage that well. So Spock's like, wow, how logical. Even though it's like barely logical, why not just fuck Spock and let him go back to space and then continue seeing the other Vulcan dude while Spock's gone? Because then there would be no excuse for the plot to give us this. Anyway, Spock is about to turn himself into the authorities because he's freaking out that he killed Kirk for real. But Kirk returns from being fake dead, causing Spock to smile for one of the only times in the entire series. This is a recurring thing throughout the show. Spock doesn't smile unless drugged or brainwashed because that's not the Vulcan way. But sometimes Captain Kirk just makes him so happy inside that he has to smile anyway, even when he's in his right mind. Kirk is literally the only character he's ever shown to smile for unless he's drugged or brainwashed. So then McCoy asks Spock, so did you actually end up marrying that woman or mating with her, the woman you went to Vulcan solely to bang? Because you don't seem feral anymore. And Spock literally says, oh, right, the girl. He completely forgot about her. In the end, Spock did not fuck T'Pring, but his blood fever was cured anyway. He concludes, verbatim, I quote, "It must have been the combat." Yeah, there's never been any indication that the rules of Ponfar allow for Vulcans to fight instead of mate, otherwise Spock wouldn't have compromised his entire Starfleet career to get to Vulcan for the arranged marriage that he didn't even want. Instead, he would have just gone to battle. At this point in the Star Trek canon, the Federation is still at war with the Klingons. The original series is by far the most military-adjacent iteration of Starfleet, and it regularly includes both the captain and first officer going on away missions that involve combat. Spock has had more than enough opportunities for combat in his career. The desire was not to fight. It was to fuck, and anything less meant he would die. So why did the combat cure the blood fever? Because it wasn't combat, it was symbolic sex. They mated. Theodore Sturgeon wrote this. He wrote a plot in which these two guys have to engage in a mating ritual where one of them is proven to be too horny to function, and they're not allowed to stop until one of them finishes. Allegorically, or dies. They figuratively mated. Wrestling with Captain Kirk cured Spock's horny fever that can only be cured with sexual action, meaning that the show acknowledges this as sexual action. They gave this episode to Theodore Sturgeon. Fucking mad lads, I love it. Actually, hold on, real quick. Let's take a look at how the extremely based and ally flag-pilled Theodore Sturgeon himself actually wrote the combat into the script back in 1967. So about 6 months ago, Twitter user Divine Beast Mode posted the following. Someone in one of my discords was sharing pages from a physical copy of the Amok Time script from 1967, and some of the stage direction is absolutely wild as fuck, you guys. Like, what we see on screen is the result of unhinged shit like this. God bless you, Theodore Sturgeon. And here is how he wrote it, okay? The fight, another angle. They come together like an automobile accident, belly to belly, free hand holding weapon wrist, glaring into each other's eyes, a moment of great strain. As Kirk and Spock slowly approach each other, Lurpa's ready, they circle, then Spock lets out a karate-type ejaculation, leaps and swings. Kirk parries it, swings about. Alright everyone, tag yourself. I'm karate-type ejaculation. Apparently the music during this fight scene is considered to be iconic, but I always forget what it is until I rewatch the episode for the millionth time, because there's only one song that my brain can associate with this episode, and it's I Just Died in Your Arms Tonight. I even made a fan vid more than 5 years ago that I posted on this very channel in February of 2019, recutting this episode to set it to that song. I got copyright claimed to hell and back, so I think it's unlisted, but I'll link it in the description below so you guys can watch it if you want. It's also worth noting that historically, using death or the completion of life as a symbol for sexual completion has been a long-standing trope throughout literature. We can see this in the French phrase le petit mort, which translates directly to little death, but is used figuratively as a euphemism for sexual orgasm. Sexual orgasm, of course, as opposed to a karate-type ejaculation. And it kind of makes sense when you think about it. Humans are so incredibly over-evolved and overdeveloped compared to most other non-human animals. We overthink everything, even the things that are just instinctual or a natural part of life for other animals. In our case, sexual activity is often equated with being carnal and animalistic. It's an urge that most humans have, just as most animals have, because it's often what causes the continuation of the species. Similarly, death is something that all living things must face, human and non-human animals alike. It doesn't matter how advanced our minds are if in the end we're all just become part of the ground the same way every other animal does. And due to these connections with our more primal instincts all throughout recorded human history, death and sex have been linked symbolically, often in the figurative sense. Using the concept of death in accordance with a sexual connotation was common in the work of William Shakespeare, for example. Let's take a look at this example from the SparkNotes page breaking down Romeo and Juliet. Juliet says, "Come, gentle knight, come, loving black-browed knight, give me my Romeo, and when I shall die, take him and cut him out in little stars." Juliet yearns for her wedding night. The repetition of the word come shows us the strength of her desire. There's no ambiguity about what Juliet is yearning for. Die was Elizabethan slang for orgasm. The image that follows of Romeo cut out in little stars is a subtle metaphor for the sexual ecstasy Juliet anticipates. In a paper originally published in the Nassau Literary Review and later posted to Medium, Nicolette D'Angelo, student of classics at Oxford, explains, "In many of these plays, Shakespeare makes the woman's death so striking specifically by infusing it with a potent sense of sexuality. Through looking at the death scenes and corpses of the main women of Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, Antony and Cleopatra, and King Lear, we can see larger trends emerge concerning female sexuality in Shakespeare and its relationship to death, corpses, and the female body at large." She then continues with an example breaking down the sexually coded death imagery in the play Hamlet. At first glance, Ophelia's death seems to be a strikingly beautiful, lyrical depiction of a woman drowning. However, as one delves deeper with an eye towards its abundance of sexual images, it becomes evident that the natural world in the scene is parallel to a sexual aggressor, presenting a forceful, male-coded form of sexuality that has plagued Ophelia elsewhere in the play. After Ophelia is dead, Hamlet, the perpetrator of that sexual aggression, continues to sexualize her body when he wrestles in her grave. In Shakespeare's time, as in our own, the grave was often referred to as the final resting place, not only because of its finality, but also because of the visual similarity between a body lying in a coffin and a body lying in bed, which is, of course, the quintessential resting place. This visual and idiomatic link between graves and beds then casts a darkly sexual overtone to the scene at Ophelia's grave. When Ophelia is dead, Hamlet finally enters her bed. But it's not like Star Trek necessarily followed this, right? It's not like Star Trek was painfully aware of Shakespeare or absolutely stuffed full of literary symbolism prevalent through all of the classics, right? It's not like Theodore Sturgeon wrote this episode in which death is used as a symbol for figurative sexual completion that the plot requires there to be in order for resolution, right? In Season 2, Episode 3, The Changeling, not much romantic progression happens, but we do get this.
No mask. Sterilized. No.
It was damaged in deep space. And undoubtedly the meteor collision, its memory banks were destroyed or
Sterilized.
But let's move into more textual character development. Season 2, Episode 5, The Apple, finds the Enterprise crew landing on a planet very similar to the biblical story about the Garden of Eden. This planet is a paradise, but in order for all the people to remain young and immortal and living in a paradise, they must feed a cave with a giant Zardoz-style head that governs them, and this cave can only talk to one person, and also they can't question it, and none of them ever want to have sex. It's a weird plot, as per usual, okay? But we do get some romantic subplot development. Back in Season 1, we saw that Spock is prone to emotional outbursts exclusively when Captain Kirk is threatened. In fact, even when he's not actually threatened, when Spock perceives that his captain could theoretically become threatened in the future, he freaks out. Whereas he'll watch the other crew members die and be like, I'm gonna stay logical. On this planet, there's these flowers that shoot thorns at you that incapacitate you. Spock notices these thorns pointing themselves at his beloved captain, and, well...
Find in paradise.
Jim!
Yeah, he just jumped in front of it. No warning, just took the bullet for him. Was that really logical, Spock? Well, let's find out.
Just what do you think you were trying to do?
I surmised you were unaware of that plant, so I
Stepped in front and took the thorns yourself.
I assure you, Captain, I had no intention of doing that. It was merely my own clumsiness which prevented me from moving out of the way.
I see. Well, next time, just yell. I can step out of the way as quickly as the next man.
Yep, as always, he denies it, and it's played for humor. Oh, Spock, look at you, pretending not to be in love with the captain again. Season 2, Episode 9, Metamorphosis, is also a significant episode, even if the effects are just a little bit dated. Like just a little bit dated. This episode introduces us to the character of Zefram Cochrane, who will become important in the Next Generation movie First Contact from 1996. This episode establishes Zefram Cochrane in the Star Trek lore as the creator of the warp drive, the one whose developments led to humans and Vulcans eventually making First Contact, which ultimately led to all the events that happened in every Star Trek series. Zefram was said to have died more than a century ago, but actually, when the Enterprise shuttle Galileo finds him living on a mostly deserted planet, it turns out he's been alive, kept living in stasis without aging, due to the powers of a strange alien called the Companion, which presents itself as a body of light and colors rather than having humanoid flesh. Over the course of the episode, Kirk eventually realizes why Zefram has stayed on this planet with this strange beam of light for 150 years. The two of them have fallen in love. Using the tricorder to speak with the Companion, Kirk tries his best to convey a universal explanation of what it means to fall in love in a way that both humans and non-human aliens can understand. Here is how he defines being in love.
Companion, you love the man.
I do not understand.
Is he important to you? More important than anything? Is he as though he were a part of you?
Much like the similar definition we got in Dagger of the Mind, here we learn that to Captain Kirk, being truly in love with someone requires sacrifice. You need to hold that person as more important to you than anything else. And here he also adds, is it as though he were a part of you? It's worth noting here that in the writing of Star Trek characters, Gene Roddenberry did intend for Spock to be a part of Kirk. Here's what he said in an interview back in the 1970s. I definitely designed it as a love relationship, and I hope that for men who have been afraid of such relationships, that they would encourage them to be able to feel love and affection, true affection, love, friendship, and deep respect. That was the relationship I tried to draw. I think I also tried to draw a feeling of belief that very few of us are complete unto ourselves. It's quite a lovely thing, where two halves make a whole. So we do know, at the very least, the intention is for these two to be a part of each other. Without each other, neither of them is whole. And we'll see this in more pieces in later episodes, and especially in the movies, where that will then be put to the test, where without each other, each individual is incomplete. We also have to ask what it means to Captain Kirk to have a person be more important to him than anything else. Note that here he doesn't say anyone, but anything. I think that's significant. To have someone be important than anyone else, that means that they will win out against all other relationships in our lives with other beings. But for them to be more important than anything, that not only means they must win out against all other beings, but also they must be more important to you than the other non-relationship aspects of your life as well. More important than your career, than your reputation, than your own personal goals. If someone can outweigh all of that, then you know you're truly in love. We'll keep this definition in mind as we see how Kirk struggles with this. For example, at the end of Season 1, in The City on the Edge of Forever, while time traveling in the 1930s, Kirk fell in love with a woman of the past, Edith Keeler. The love he feels for her is strong, but eventually he learns that she has to die. If she doesn't die, it will alter the course of history. At this moment, Edith is extremely important to Kirk, but is she more important than anything? More important than returning to the Enterprise, to returning to the right time period, than keeping the trajectory of human history on track rather than splitting the entire universe into a separate timeline? No, she's not more important than all of that. And as a result, reluctantly, he must let her die. Kirk has felt strong attraction before, even strong love, but he's never been in the kind of love that requires that he sacrifice it all for the other person. He's not yet been in the kind of love where the other becomes a part of him. Let's wait and see if maybe he'll find that kind of love as his arc continues. Episode 21, Patterns of Force, is a pretty wild one. Get this, okay? Someone has violated the Prime Directive. That dude who violated it, Gil, he went to another planet and thought, I'm not kidding, he thought, hey, remember Hitler? He was a bad guy, but like, he was efficient. What if I implemented all of Hitler's philosophies about strategy, but without all the prejudice and bigotry? Oh, what? That doesn't work? My entire planet somehow became Nazis? How did that happen? Shit, I shouldn't have violated the Prime Directive. This episode came out only about 20 years after the actual Holocaust, so that's like as if Star Trek made a 9/11 episode today. Anyway, Kirk and Spock are on this planet trying to un-Nazify it, and they end up in prison, and they want to find a way to escape, and this is how they do it.
Find enough power here. In the history of physics, the ancient lasers were able to achieve the necessary excitation.
Oh, Mr. Spock. Oh, my goodness. Beautiful. Oh, Spock.
It's actually a pretty good episode. It says a lot about government propaganda, about the ways that certain ideas lead to discrimination and bigotry, and how an idea can spread throughout a society like a virus, and it emphasizes the importance of Starfleet's Prime Directive, which is that as explorers, not conquerors, when meeting a society on another planet, you can interact with new alien beings, but you can't attempt to change society or interfere with their existing way of life. And also, we learned that half-naked handcuffed Kirk was excited for half-naked handcuffed Spock to step on him. Episode 25, Bread and Circuses, takes place on a planet with a society modeled after the ancient Roman Empire. On this planet, Spock and McCoy are imprisoned while Kirk is in danger of being executed. While in prison, McCoy and Spock have this extremely emotionally telling exchange.
Why, you wouldn't know what to do with a genuine, warm, decent feeling.
Really, Doctor?
I know. I'm worried about Jim, too.
So McCoy's out here being prejudiced against Vulcans as per usual, making fun of Spock for not having any feelings, but then he's like, you wouldn't know what to do with a warm, decent feeling, would ya? And Spock goes, really, Doctor? What does that mean? It's clearly sarcasm. He's saying, come on, McCoy, you know that I have feelings, okay? And in response, McCoy picks up what he's putting down and he says, I'm worried about Jim too. That's an acknowledgement that, yes, Spock, I understand you do have feelings, but only when Captain Kirk is involved. Meanwhile, Spock looks miserable, like, oh no, my secret is out. Spock later has to fight Achilles, which, I mean, if you know anything about how this show treats Allusions and how mythology treats Achilles and how this show treats Spock going into combat, I'll let you decide what that means. Just look at how the camera pans after he says that line. We see Spock literally and figuratively imprisoned as he hides his face in guilt, knowing he's been found out. I genuinely, I really can't think of any other way that makes sense to read this scene. Season 3, Episode 4, And the Children Shall Lead is pretty forgettable in my opinion, but it does give us this.
I'm losing command.
Captain, I've lost command.
I've got command.
And then Kirk calms down because Spock's sultry voice brought him back down to Earth. Not down to Earth, down to space, the floor of the Enterprise. You know what I mean. In episode 12, The Empath, the away team meets an empathic woman who doesn't speak. When Kirk is injured and Spock goes to examine, we get a lovely scene communicated all through facial expressions and camera work. We watch as the camera follows Spock tending to Kirk while the empath reads his emotions. We see the camera cut back and forth between their faces, indicating that she's receiving input from him and that she's understanding some kind of message message that his emotions are conveying. Gently placing a hand on his shoulder, she stares at him and smiles. She's noticed something sweet about what he's feeling, about what's going on in his head. Episode 19, Requiem for Methuselah, comes toward the end of season 3, meaning the end of the original show's full run. And I think this is significant because in this episode, we see the furthest progression of Spock's arc when it comes to accepting that he does have feelings and that those feelings are uniquely awakened by Captain Kirk. Here's the premise of what happened. While on another planet trying to find a specific mineral to cure a fever breaking out on the Enterprise, Kirk meets a man named Flint who lives with a beautiful woman named Reyna. With Flint's encouragement, Kirk and Reyna begin spending time together, bonding as they dance to a waltz that Spock plays on the piano. Kirk soon falls in love with Reyna and he doesn't want to leave her behind. But soon we learn the truth. Flint is thousands of years old, and during that time he became lonely, so he created Reyna as an android to keep him company. He was hoping that Kirk could help her learn the concept of love so that she could then apply that to learning how to love Flint. In the end, Reyna dies, and Kirk is extremely sad about this. Toward the end of the episode, Spock and McCoy are with Kirk in his quarters, helping him through the struggle that he's going through, and this is the scene that we get.
You'll never know the things that love can drive a man to. The ecstasies, the miseries, the broken rules, the desperate chances, the glorious failures, the glorious victories. All of these things you'll never know, simply because the word love isn't written into your book. Good night, Spock.
Good night, Doctor.
I do wish he could forget her.
McCoy tells Spock that he feels sorry that he'll never fall in love, and since he's so intent on keeping all these emotional walls up around himself, he'll never know the joy, the pain, the failure, the victory, the sacrifice that comes from love. He'll never feel it. Will he? Has he? McCoy mentions that if Kirk could forget Reyna, things would be better for him. It could help him overcome the pain, but unfortunately he can't forget. He can't be made to. Unless someone were to love him enough, to desire to sacrifice for him enough, to take a risk to make that happen. Right? Well, once Dr. McCoy leaves, Spock does the following. Is there a logical reason for Spock to mind meld with Kirk just to telepathically inspire him to forget this woman? No, why would Spock even think to do that? Logically, he wouldn't. But emotionally, McCoy did just deliver Spock a pretty big speech about what love can do to a man, about the risks he'll take, the sacrifices, the things he'll do selflessly for the other person. And in response, Spock realizes that he has to do something to help Kirk heal, because that's love. It actually makes a lot of sense that after this episode, Spock is now further in a place of being conflicted about the emotions that he's feeling. As we'll see, in our first property that comes after the series ends, the motion picture, Spock begins that within a state of emotional turmoil. Star Trek ended after 3 seasons, as they were stated to be on a 5-year mission, and Star Trek the Motion Picture came out 12 years after the first show began. Many fans referred to the 7 years in between as the lost years, as in there is no canonical content that exists to tell us what happened between the end of the 5-year mission and the beginning of the events of the motion picture. Let's talk about the motion picture. The movies. At the beginning of Star Trek the Motion Picture, Spock is off at Vulcan conversion therapy praying the gay away. By which I mean Spock has left Starfleet behind, instead choosing to pursue a ritual called Kolinar, which is the Vulcan ritual to purge oneself of all emotion. It seems to be a sort of meditative ritual, and if completed successfully, the Vulcan participant should no longer have to feel any emotions at all. If we look at the overall arc of Star Trek, both of the show and movies, as lying somewhere on the Blake Snyder Save the Cat structured style plot outline, this would be Spock's all is lost moment. It would be the point about 3/4 of the way through his arc when things reach their lowest point, right before something is going to flip in the action leading to the climax, and then the falling action and the resolution. And this does make sense pacing-wise when we look at this arc on the show as a whole, with the movie being a conclusion to the show. Throughout all 3 seasons of Star Trek, Spock's consistent struggle has been with trying to suppress his emotional impulses in order to maintain a feeling of logical superiority that he believes he must achieve in order to prove himself as a Vulcan. And throughout the show, we've seen moments of Spock showing bits of emotion, those emotions being beneficial to himself and the crew, and struggling to square the fact that all his life he's been taught that feelings are bad, with the fact that real life experience has just shown shown him otherwise. Somewhere in the lost years, Spock had to make a decision as the 5-year mission ended. Does he remain in Starfleet and continue to live among humans, forced to accept that emotions will forever remain a part of his life? Or does he return to Vulcan and attempt to rid himself of all emotions? The way Spock's arc is set up, we as the audience know that the happy ending, the true resolution, is when he learns to accept his emotional side. But Spock isn't there yet. First, he has farther to fall. Things have to get worse before they can get better. And we know that through the TV series, a constant source of emotion for Spock has been the affection he feels for Captain Kirk, which is first set up in the yearning passage style monologue in The Naked Time, the very first episode that we discussed earlier.
Jim, when I feel friendship for you, I'm ashamed.
And then continues to prove true time and time again as the show goes on, when Spock regularly experiences irrational impulses to help Kirk against his more logical judgment. Spock is about to reach Vulcan nirvana when instead he fails. He can't do it. He can't stop himself from feeling. And what is he thinking about when this happens? What is he thinking about as he fails Kolinar? He can't stop thinking about how much he's going to miss Captain Kirk. Now, you might be thinking, wait, hold on, Savvy, we can't read Spock's mind. We, the audience, are not telepathic Vulcans ourselves. How do we know that Spock can't complete Kolinar because he's thinking about Captain Kirk specifically? Like, isn't part of it that there's the V'ger entity out there mind melding with him? Couldn't he be thinking about anything else potentially at this moment? There might be too many emotional topics in general. How could you even possibly know what he's thinking about? That's a great question. Good thing there's a book with a rainbow cover.
I looked it up, and the rainbow first appeared as a gay symbol in 1978 at a gay pride parade in San Francisco. And San Francisco has pretty much always been associated with gays, but it especially came around in World War I, because that's when they went on this avid hunt for gays in the military, and they kicked like 9,000 people out, and most of them were booted to San Francisco. So the city thing and the rainbow thing both were established before the first movie even came out.
Book written by Gene Roddenberry himself, so we know it's legit. And you know what's great about this book? We don't actually have to read that much to know why Spock's failing so badly at conversion therapy. The book found it significant enough to tell us right there before the title page. A lot of the trade paperbacks of this era had a page with an excerpt of the book before the book actually started, so you could get a glimpse of what you'd be reading. Like, now we have Amazon's Look Inside feature, but in this case, they'd select text from later in the book to get you interested. And the text they selected was Spock's epic fail at Kolinar. Let's read it. Spock had looked up at the red dawn sky in the direction where he knew Sol and Earth to be, and had begun a respectful but brief last farewell to his mother's planet, and the part of his life that it represented. He had long ago decided that he would neither return to that place, nor move among its people ever again. Jim! Goodbye, my Tahila. This is the last time I will permit myself to think of you, or even your name, again. He's thinking about Jim, about Captain Kirk, and he doesn't think of him as Captain, he thinks about him as Jim, his nickname, and he thinks of him as my Tahila. Forgive me if I'm pronouncing that wrong. Tahila is the quintessential word you've seen written but never heard aloud, because it's never actually said aloud in the movie. It was created for the book. It's a Vulcan word, and what does it mean? Remember earlier in this video when I talked about how Gene Roddenberry likes to troll us, how he likes to give fence-sitting answers in response to whether these two are in love or not? It turns out he didn't just do this when answering interview questions. He also did it completely unprompted. Like, he didn't have to come up with a special word to describe their relationship because it's not even in the movie. He just wanted to. And then he created a similar word, Imzadi, for Troy and Riker in The Next Generation. That's interesting. The word Tahila, are you ready for this? This directly translates from Vulcan to mean friend, brother, lover. He really did it again. He really said, I made up a special word just to describe Spock's feelings that he exclusively has for Captain Kirk. And what does the word mean? It means they're in love, but also it means that they're just bros. The word means multiple things. Whichever way you interpreted it, you're right. This is like Sappho and her friend levels of cope at this point, right? It's not like he chose an existing word that already had multiple meanings. He made up a new word for the Vulcan language and then gave it all those meanings, and it wasn't in the movie, so he didn't even have to. He just did this to fuck with us. He was like, I made up a word to describe this relationship. It applies to married couples and also siblings. And he didn't have to do it.
And you did it at my birthday dinner.
Like, it's not like someone asked him on the spot in an interview, what Vulcan word would you use to describe their relationship? So he had to give a middle-of-the-road answer. It's not like this word was in the movie. It was made the fuck up just for this book. Why? Gene, my brother in Christ. My brother, friend, and lover in Christ, my Tahila and Surak esteemed prophet from ancient Vulcan, you're the one who decided to make this up out of nowhere, all on your own, nobody even asked. So this discussion of the word Tahila is a great segue into the footnote on page 22 of this book. The footnote is infamous in the Star Trek gay versus not gay debate. Much like the interview I referenced earlier, this footnote is yet another example of fence-sitting. It's another carefully worded paragraph that through the magic of language can be read either way, and as a result has regularly been used as definitive proof that they were in love and also as definitive proof that they were not in love. Both sides use this footnote as proof. I'll read it to you, but first we need some context. This book is written as if Captain Kirk has given interviews and then a biographer took those interviews and wrote a book based on the events of said interviews. This footnote is supposed to be an interview question that within the Star Trek universe was asked to Captain Kirk, so let's read it. Editor's note: the human concept of friend is most nearly duplicated in Vulcan thought by the term Tahila, which can also mean brother and lover. Spock's recollection from which this chapter is drawn is that it was a most difficult moment for him, since he did indeed consider Kirk to have become his brother. However, because Tahila can be used to mean lover, and since Kirk and Spock's friendship was unusually close, this has led to some speculation over whether they had actually indeed become lovers. At our request, Admiral Kirk supplied the following comment on this subject. Okay, we're gonna read that in a second, but I need to pause and say real quick, now not only is there a word that means both sibling and spouse that was created out of nowhere to describe this relationship, but also it's now been established that other people within the fictional Star Trek universe are pondering these guys' relationship enough to ask about it, like other people in Star Trek. Other characters have picked up on something going on with them. In terms of the definition of brothers, I need to make it clear also that Kirk and Spock don't consider each other to be brothers in the literal, like, blood sibling sense. Kirk has a brother who dies in the episode Operation Annihilate and is never brought up again. Kirk mourns him for like 5 seconds and then doesn't really care anymore. Spock has a brother who he fails to mention until the 5th movie, and then he's barely brought up again either. The concept of brothers exists for these two already, and their relationship is canonically established to be way more in-depth and impactful than the concept of brothers. So now it's time for Admiral Kirk to tell us whether or not he and Spock are in a romantic relationship. To be clear, at this point, canonically, they're not. Like, narratively, they're not yet. Even though they're in love with each other, story and plot-wise, they're not actually together until the end of Star Trek The Motion Picture. We'll get there. Right now in this book, we're at the beginning of Star Trek The Motion Picture. We're still on the romantic subplots arc. In most episodes of The Next Generation, if you were to ask Commander Riker whether he and Deanna Trey were currently in a relationship, the answer would be no, as the development of the relationship unfolds throughout the course of the show. But we, as the audience, know that they're going through a romantic arc together, and similarly here, we are still on this arc for Kirk and Spock. So even if he had just said, no, we're not in a relationship, it still wouldn't negate the fact that they enter a relationship at the end of the story. But he doesn't even say that, okay. So anyway, now Admiral Kirk is asked this question, and the fact that he's actually asked this means we now have confirmation that canonically within the Star Trek universe, other characters have picked up on what's going on between these two. Rumors exist, people have noticed the tension. Not just the viewers, the other beings in the Star Trek universe have noticed this. The book didn't need to go so hard, but it did. None of this is even in the movie. It's just here to troll everyone, I guess. So how should Kirk answer this question? Well, if he and Spock are not in love, he could say no. If they are, he could say yes. If he's currently in love with him and they're still only 75% of the way through their romantic arc's plot progression, like I've said, then it would be kind of complicated to answer that. How could he answer that? Good thing he's a character written by Gene Roddenberry, who's a goddamn expert at talking in circles, because that's what Kirk's gonna do here too. He says, I was never aware of this lover's rumor, although I have been told that Spock encountered it several times. Apparently he had always dismissed it with the characteristic lifting of his right eyebrow, which usually connoted some combination of surprise, disbelief, and or annoyance. As for myself, although I have no moral or other objections to physical love in any of its many earthly, alien, and mixed forms, I've always found my best gratification in that creature future woman. Also, I would dislike being thought of as so foolish that I would select a partner who only came into sexual heat once every 7 years. All right, let's unpack that. That statement is straight up an optical illusion, okay? It's someone going, what do you see in this ink blot? Do you see a butterfly? Or do you see your mom sucking the mailman's dick? That's why it gets used as definitive proof for both sides of the argument. Let's break it down. The "they're not gay" interpretation of this sentence is fairly easy to see, okay? Look, right there, Kirk says he likes women, and he said that it would be weird to date someone who only fucks every 7 years. See? But if you've been watching Star Trek from the beginning, you know that it's not that straightforward, okay? You know how Captain Kirk is characterized. He's a guy who knows how to answer a question. Time and time again throughout the series, when put in a difficult situation, Captain Kirk constantly has to find ways to balance being honest and truthful with saying the right thing for the situation. And even more so now that he's an admiral, the dude's a diplomat now, okay? If an honest answer were, no, there's nothing going on between us and never has been and never will be, he would have said that. Just in terms of character consistency. Kirk only talks like this. We're talking about this! When there's something bigger beneath the surface. And let's be clear. If you look at that statement, there's nowhere where he denies it. Nowhere. The first thing he does is tell us that Spock encountered this rumor several times. The first thing the footnote does is tell us, multiple people within the Star Trek universe have gone up to Spock and have seen enough sexual tension to go up to Spock and ask him if he and Kirk were banging, to which Spock also doesn't answer. He just raises his eyebrow, which the show has shown us time and time again is what he does in response to literally everything anyone says to him. So again, it means nothing. Then Kirk talks about how he's had the most sex with women, as if we didn't already know that, as if we didn't watch all of Star Trek and Kirk's many female sexcapades, as if bisexuality weren't already a known concept. Kirk then tells us he wouldn't like to be thought of as someone who'd be so silly as to have sex only every 7 years. Good thing throughout the entire canon of Star Trek, it's been shown multiple times that Vulcans can and do fuck outside of Pon farr. It's just that during Pon farr, when they're in heat, they have to fuck or else they'll die. But other times, they still can do it. For example, in the season 1 episode, This Side of Paradise, when Spock is under the influence of a strange plant that makes everyone all roofied out, he has relations with a woman named Layla. Kirk is banking on the interviewer not knowing this fact about Vulcans. The footnote is so fucking fascinating to me that I have to keep talking about it for a bit because there's still more to this here, okay? The Star Trek fan lore page has collected a series of fan reactions throughout the years to this footnote, and I think we need to take a look at some of them. I need everyone to understand just how truly insane this is. So let's look at an excerpt from an essay that was published in the fanzine Naked Times issue number 3 back in 1979, shortly after this book came out. Here is what essayist Christopher Randolph writes. Essentially, it comes across as if the editor tried to appease all segments of fandom with the deliberately vague wording, but ended up appeasing no one, only adding more fuel for discussion and arguments. That was written, wait for it, 45 years ago. In the same issue, also 45 years ago, writer Diane T. Jeffords also wrote an editorial about this footnote, arguing the following. Our good admiral begins by saying he was never aware of the rumor, though he had been told that Spock encountered it several times. Is not a state of awareness brought on by knowledge of the subject in question? Kirk admits he did have that knowledge, apparently learned through Spock or through a person who had the opportunity to talk to both of them personally. Who made Kirk aware of the rumor is irrelevant. Logic dictates that Kirk was and is aware of it. It would be interesting to know about Spock's encounters with the rumor. It's difficult to imagine someone, even McCoy, walking up casually to Spock and asking if he and Kirk were indeed lovers. Spock's demeanor doesn't encourage one to make flippant, out-of-place remarks about his sex life. I would have been less surprised if Kirk had encountered it in a spaceship bar. Once past the never-aware contradiction, Kirk tells us Spock apparently had always dismissed it with the characteristic lifting of his right eyebrow. Since Kirk was apparently not there, we have to assume that Spock informed him of this standard reaction. Jim, I raised my right eyebrow at that lovers rumor. Somehow I suspect I've been told that the second card is turned up except on Thursdays. That's a reference to the episode A Piece of the Action, in which Kirk is shown to be quite good at bluffing at card games and making up rules as he goes along to get himself out of weird situations. The double talk concludes with a joke about Pon farr. Charming, but not convincing, Admiral. In regards to the 7-year cycle, Kirk chortles, I would dislike being thought so foolish, etc. Even here, the wording is double talk, and it denies nothing. Of course, several episodes of aired Star Trek conveyed the idea that Spock was not at all limited to a once-in-7-year cycle. Kirk really sounds like he's using lawyer speak here. I wish I were a lawyer so that I could analyze it from a legal perspective. Just kidding, I don't wish I were a lawyer. Being a lawyer sounds awful. And I don't actually need to be a lawyer to do this, because a lawyer has already broken this down in 1980. Because, as it turns out, Admiral Kirk's wonderful roundabout circular doublespeak makes a great example of how we dissect legalese. The lawyer's name was Judith Gran, and she published the following essay in the fanzine Kindred Spirits, which ran from 1982 to 1998. This was published there in 1985 as a reprint of an essay she published elsewhere 5 years earlier. So we're gonna break it down. I honestly think what I'm about to read you guys is the greatest piece of writing ever written, okay? In my opinion. Get ready. Readers who are familiar with Leo Strauss's Persecution and the Art of Writing and other works will recognize the approach I use here. Strauss found that the writings of Al-Farabi, Spinoza, Machiavelli, and other thinkers who expressed unpopular ideas on topics that were controversial in their times, such as the existence of God and the relation between religion and philosophy, required a minute textual exegesis. These controversial figures tended to express their ideas on both an exoteric and esoteric level of meaning. The first aimed at the average reader, the second at the more careful reader, who would be alerted to search for the meaning beneath the surface by certain deliberate ambiguities in the text. As a challenge to prevailing orthodoxy, homosexuality is as controversial as the denial of religion in the age of Machiavelli. It is understandable that the producer of a mass audience TV show and film might be reluctant to state too directly that his most popular characters have had such a relationship. Does Roddenberry's footnote contain different levels of meaning? Okay, so far, I know we're at the beginning, but this makes me want to be an English teacher again. Judith! You're making me want to go teach English again. So Judith continues by breaking it down sentence by sentence. I was never aware of this lover's rumor. Kirk may be saying here merely that A, he was unaware of the existence of such a rumor, or in addition to A, he may also mean B, that the rumor itself is untrue. Of course, A may be true even if B is false. Even if the rumor referred to true events, Kirk might nevertheless have failed to encounter that rumor and thus have been unaware that it was circulating. Does Kirk also intend to imply that the rumor itself is untrue? We might argue from the contrapositive. If the event in question had been true, Kirk would have been aware of it, therefore by definition he would have been aware of that which the rumor states. Thus, he could not be unaware of the rumor. Since he was unaware of the rumor, the facts alleged in the rumor could not have been true. However, the flaw in this argument is that it glosses over the distinction between unawareness of the subject matter of the rumor and unawareness of the fact that the rumor existed. Indeed, Kirk's choice of words also glosses over this obvious distinction, which leads us to suspect him of a deliberate attempt to obfuscate the issue. The ambiguity is compounded by Kirk's use of several different verb tenses in this sentence and the next, a use of words that succeeds in totally confusing the reader about the sequences of events to which Kirk is referring and leaves us in doubt as to when Kirk was unaware of the rumor. He cannot have been unaware of the rumor up to the time when the editor first asked him to comment on it, although his use of the simple past tense at first suggests this, for he goes on to say, although I have been told that Spock encountered it several times. Kirk could not have remained unaware of the rumor after having been told that Spock encountered it several times. The linking of the two clauses, therefore, and the parallel construction of the sentence, Kirk's experience with the rumor versus Spock's experience with the rumor, supports the interpretation that Kirk is discussing only his failure to encounter the rumor, rather than the truth or falsity of the rumor itself. Apparently, for an unspecified period of time, Kirk remained unaware that the rumor was in circulation. This does not tell us whether the rumor is true or false. Apparently, he had always dismissed it with his characteristic lifting of his right eyebrow, which usually connoted some combination of surprise, disbelief, and/or annoyance. Spock did not apparently deny the rumor when he encountered it, neither did he confirm it. He simply remained silent and raised one eyebrow. Was his silence an effort to avoid self-incrimination? We must avoid such a hasty conclusion, for Kirk has apparently supplied us with the tools for decoding Spock's raised eyebrow. According to Kirk, Spock could have meant A, surprise and disbelief, B, surprise and concern, C, surprise, disbelief, and annoyance, D, annoyance only, or E, none of the above. Alternatives A and C, since they include disbelief as an element of Spock's reaction, suggest the untruth of the rumor, though not conclusively. Alternatives B, D, and E are consistent with either a true or false rumor. Surprise may mean no more than surprise at the existence of the rumor. Annoyance may mean annoyance at a violation of his and Kirk's own privacy. Nor do these meanings exhaust the possible meanings of Spock's raised eyebrow, quote, usually. Not only are we still in the dark about whether the rumor is true then, but we do not even know how Spock felt when he was confronted by it. As for myself, although I have no moral or other objection to physical love in its many earthly, alien, and mixed forms, I have always found my best gratification in that creature woman. This is the key sentence in Kirk's comment, for it is here that Kirk defines his own sexual attitudes. At first glance, the sentence seems to be a simple affirmation that Kirk is interested in making love only with women, but this is not what the sentence says. The key to its meaning is the phrase best best gratification. Each word is highly significant. 1. Best is a comparative term. For there to be a best, there must be other items for comparison. Kirk did not say that he receives his only gratification in women, merely that women are for him the most gratifying sexual partners. Therefore, he has presumably taken other partners who are not women and received at least some gratification from these encounters. The obvious implication is that Kirk has tried at least one, probably more given the use of the superlative best, which requires at least 3 different items for comparison, of the other forms of physical love, which he enumerates in the first clause of this sentence. Okay, Judith, I owe my life to you. Judith really straight up said, okay, wait, hold on. The way Captain Kirk or Admiral Kirk worded this does not make sense unless he is acknowledging that he is bi. Captain Kirk is a bisexual icon, confirmed, or else the sentence that he just said makes no sense logically, as the Vulcans might say. Judith continues. The choice of the term gratification to describe Kirk's preference for women is also highly significant. In the course of this sentence, Kirk inexplicably slips from the general term physical love to the considerably narrower term gratification. While physical love connotes the sexual expression of love for another being, gratification generally refers in the sexual context to the physical satiation of sexual needs. To put it another way, gratification is only one aspect of physical love. All Kirk has told us is that he finds sex with women more gratifying, i.e., more effective for achieving physical satisfaction than with other creatures. He is silent on the other dimensions of physical love, joy, tenderness, and all the emotional and spiritual satisfactions of physical intimacy with someone for whom one cares deeply. His abandoning the concept of physical love in favor of the concept of gratification when he compares women to other sexual partners suggests that he has deliberately narrowed the issue. Why does Kirk abandon the discussion of the whole, physical love, for a discussion of a part of the whole, gratification? The effect of his statement is to define for us the precise area of sexuality within which he finds women, quote, always the, quote, best. By narrowing his focus to this single point, Kirk has managed to distract us from the real question: whether he has had a physical love relationship with a particular person, Spock, who is not a woman. If the editor had asked Kirk whether he had a love affair with Edith Keeler, a skinny brunette, and Kirk had replied obliquely, "I have always found my best gratification in voluptuous blondes," we would surely appreciate how inadequate a statement of general erotic preference is an answer to a question about a particular love relationship. Further, we know that Kirk ranks love above technique, which is presumably the source of gratification. On page 185 of the novel, Kirk considers whether he might be a better choice than Decker to seduce the Ilia probe because of his superior sexual experience. He rejects the idea because he knows that Ilia loves Decker and that sexual technique always comes out a poor runner-up in any race with love. Given Kirk's own views on the relative value of gratification and love, his evasion of a question about physical love with an answer to a non-existent question about gratification becomes all the more significant. Oof, this is satisfying. She's like, okay, let's look at the way Kirk is characterized, not just in Star Trek as a whole, but actually solely in this particular book adaptation of Star Trek the Motion Picture. Here, I got page numbers, I got quotes, I can prove that Kirk draws a distinction within this very piece of media. I'm having a writer adrenaline rush right now. I'm feeling what I feel when I break down Eminem's rhyme schemes. Linguistic euphoria. Is that a term? If not, I'm coining it now. This is linguistic euphoria. Judith, the eighth wonder of the world that she is, continues. Also, I would dislike being thought of as so foolish that I would select a love partner who came into sexual heat only once every 7 years. Kirk argues that persons who think that Vulcans are sexually functional only once every 7 years would consider him foolish if he knew he had a Vulcan sexual partner. He does not tell us whether Vulcans are actually functional only once every 7 years, nor indeed whether anyone actually holds this opinion or not. Of course, if Vulcans do happen to be sexually functional at all times, and not only once every 7 years, there is nothing foolish at all about having a Vulcan lover, and Kirk has merely executed another clever evasive maneuver for our benefit. Kirk does not tell us whether he thinks it would be foolish to take a Vulcan mate, only that he would prefer not to look foolish in the eyes of others. It is highly unlikely that Kirk would refuse to take a Vulcan lover because of the false stereotype held by outsiders, although that might be a reason for not advertising the relationship once it existed. Kirk has used a popular stereotype about Vulcans as a smokescreen to conceal his refusal to answer the simple question: have he and Spock been lovers? Indeed, perhaps the most significant fact about the footnote is that when the editor asked Kirk a simple, straightforward question, he was rewarded not with a simple, straightforward yes or no, but with a complicated 106-word statement that, when deciphered, has managed to totally avoid the issue. I'm personally in the camp that the footnote confirms there was something gay going on, not denies it. Imagine this playing out in a real interview real quick, okay? Hey, Admiral Kirk, are you and Spock in gay love? Oh, someone asked Spock that the other day. He raised his eyebrow instead of answering. Okay, cool. So are you? Am I what? Are you in love with Spock? I've been with a lot of women, you know? Yeah, I know. Trust me, everyone knows that. So, anyway, are you in love with Spock? You know, some people think Vulcans can only fuck once every 7 years. Is that true? Wouldn't it be weird to only have sex every 7 years? Yeah, that would probably be weird. So, are you in love with Spock? Do you think people think that I'm the kind of person who would only fuck every 7 years? I don't know. So anyway, are you in love with Spock? And then he just walks away. So that's what's going on with now Admiral Kirk at the beginning of Star Trek the Motion Picture. He's busy fielding questions about whether or not he and Spock were banging. Meanwhile, poor Spock is off on Vulcan trying to pray the gay away, but failing miserably because this ritual is filling his mind of fearful thoughts of never getting to think of Kirk again. I told y'all, this movie's where we're finally gonna get a resolution to the romantic subplot that's been building over the course of the entire show. So, quick summary of the plot of Star Trek the Motion Picture. Kirk has been promoted to Admiral. The Enterprise now has a new captain, Will Decker, who's played by the pastor dad from Seventh Heaven. What's wild is that Seventh Heaven and Star Trek have a lot of cast crossover. I'll put them up on screen. The mom from Seventh Heaven also plays the marine biologist who loves whales in the 4th movie. Plus, there's a lot of other cast members in common. Very different shows, though. Anyway, there's a weird entity bopping around, destroying everything. The Enterprise has to intercept it. Admiral Kirk takes over, and this makes new Captain Decker mad at him, so now they've got beef. Spock's off at Vulcan conversion therapy, and he's failing hard because he keeps thinking about how much he loves his friend, brother, lover. I guess that's the Vulcan equivalent of, like, sister wife. And then he feels a telepathic presence that he thinks could be related to the weird entity, so he returns to the Enterprise to try to fix all of this. The Enterprise has a navigator, Ilea, who's in a romantic relationship with Captain Decker. A probe from the weird entity takes Ilea away and replaces her with a robot, and Decker's really sad about that. Spock decides to attempt a Vulcan mind meld with the vessel, which is called V'ger. He fails at the mind meld because V'ger is not a being, but a machine. But what we are here in this video right now to discuss is how this leads to the conclusion of the romantic subplot. To use the Save the Cat screenplay structure terms, when on Vulcan undergoing Kolinahr, Spock was in his all is lost era. And that's when we're looking at his character arc as a whole, not the structure of this individual movie, which will have its own all is lost era toward the end, like most movies do. Anyway, Spock's falling action is going to involve him mind melding with a machine, only to realize that no, this machine can't feel shit. I, Spock, can feel, and I almost got rid of that. In a well-structured arc, the A-plot and B-plot will merge, often through solving the main want or need that's driving the story that will spark the motivation to also resolve the romantic subplot. Spock is about to resolve his own A-plot, his own lifelong struggle of having a complicated relationship with the concept of emotions as a whole. It would be really funny if the way that he solved this also motivated the resolution of the romantic subplot. Let's see what happens.
Jim. I should have known.
Wait, what should he have known?
Spock, what should you have known?
That V'ger was a machine? That feelings are good, actually?
What should you have known?
What should he have known?
Jim. This simple feeling is beyond V'ger's comprehension.
What simple feeling?
This simple feeling.
What simple feeling, Spock?
This simple feeling.
What simple feeling, Spock? What simple feeling? What simple feeling? What feeling are you referring to? What simple feeling, Spock? This
or this.
This simple feeling? What?
We're talking about this.
What's this? Oh, this? This? What you're referring to with that gesture there? So fun fact for those of you who are not balls deep in Star Trek lore, Vulcans kiss with their hands. They make this symbol, live long and prosper, instead of shaking hands because their fingers are very sensitive and hand touching is for more extreme gestures. This is established in the season 3 episode The Enterprise Incident, which is also the episode that introduces the long-running Romulan cloaking device, Romulans and Vulcans genetically are very similar. They both have common ancestors. They both got the pointy ears. The hand-touching thing applies to the Romulans too. In this episode, Spock has to seduce a hot female Romulan commander as a distraction, so he uses erotic hand-touching as a method of sexual foreplay. Wow! Looks like he can do sexual activities outside of the 7-year cycle. This is only like the 3rd or 4th time that the show has already proven this to us. Anyway, that's how we learn that touching hands for Vulcans is like the human equivalent of making out. And McCoy's just standing there watching.
Oh my god. Time and place.
See how this fits perfectly into the greater emotional arc of Spock's character growth? How the A-plot and the B-plot, the romantic subplot, perfectly merge at this moment. This is how you pace and structure a story. Spock starts out overly confident in his superiority as a logical Vulcan, but throughout the show, regularly his beliefs are tested as he starts to see small bits of benefit to having emotions as well. When he tries to deny this part of himself, he attempts to purge all feeling, but he can't, in part due to the fact that the person he loves is still on his mind. When he comes back, he tries to merge with an unfeeling machine, and he realizes that emotion isn't just something he has to tolerate, but has its own beauty within itself. And he displays that realization by finally opening up to declare love to his counterpart with a gesture of affection, referencing this feeling as in the feeling that he's sharing with Captain Kirk as what makes it all worth it. This is a great fucking story! Colleen Hoover could never! Honestly, whenever I rewatch Star Trek, I have to stop writing romance for a while because I just feel so insecure about my own abilities to ever create a love story as powerful as this one. Like, this is the gold standard. You can't beat how perfect this is. It gives me literary euphoria. I've always hoped that one day I can become skilled enough as a writer to create a romantic subplot as impactful as the one between Kirk and Spock. So I wrote 90s Kids, linked in the description below. We'll briefly discuss the next 2 movies now, The Wrath of Khan and The Search for Spock, because these movies are going to complete Kirk's character arc through the resolution of the romantic subplot from his perspective. While Spock spent the entire series and the first movie agonizing over whether or not it's actually good to feel things, Kirk has never had this problem. He's always been emotional, loyal, deeply loving from the start. Kirk's arc has been about balancing career satisfaction with personal satisfaction. If we return to, once again, The Naked Time, the episode where this all starts, where we get the direct statement of the character's yearning and the motivations that they will have to resolve as their arcs, while Kirk is drunk on space powder, he admits this personal struggle of his.
Love. You're better off without it, and I'm better off without mine. This vessel, I give. She takes. She won't permit me my life. I've got to live hers. I have a beautiful yeoman. Have you noticed her, Mr. Spock? You're allowed to notice her. The captain's not permitted.
This is where we get Kirk's honest admission of his own yearning, the want and need that he has to motivate what drives the story forward and establishes the arc he will go through as a character that develops. He says right here, he wishes he could be able to fall in love. He wants to experience the joy that comes with a relationship, but he can't because his first duty is always to the ship. Captain Kirk gives, but the Enterprise she takes. In order for Kirk's arc to be fully resolved, he now has to show that the love he has accepted into his life can outweigh his love for his ship and his career. In this scene, the beautiful yeoman that he's referring to is Janice Rand, who leaves the Enterprise after season 1, and she and Kirk never actually end up getting together. Janice and also Edith Keeler from The City on the Edge of Forever are probably Kirk's 2 biggest female love interests, the ones who make the most impact on him emotionally, but in those episodes, in the end, the Enterprise and his career always wins out. So, for our romantic subplot to be fully resolved, we have to ask the following question. Is Kirk's love for Spock greater than his devotion to the Enterprise? Is Spock the one who can surpass his devotion to his career? Let's watch the next 2 movies and find out. So back in season 1 of Star Trek, there was an episode called Space Seed in which Khan, a genetically modified 20th century man who was frozen during the eugenics wars of the 1990s, awakens and attempts to take over the Enterprise, so Kirk exiles him, he kicks him out. In the second movie, The Wrath of Khan, which came out in 1982, we learn that Khan's planet has exploded. As a result, Khan's wife was killed. Now, Khan must get revenge on Kirk for killing his wife. So, logically, as the Vulcans might say, that means that Khan is going to kill Kirk's romantic partner too, right? Like, narratively, that would make sense. That would be a satisfying setup and payoff to the viewer from a storytelling perspective. Who dies at the end of Wrath of Khan?
No! Die.
Now, as we go through all of these examples, something you might be wondering is, how much of this was intentional? How much did each writer, director, actor, editor, etc. intend for these established setups and payoffs to result in a long-term romance between two male characters? I mean, the answer, of course, is that we'll never know. I think it's pretty safe to say that everything Theodore Sturgeon did was more than intentional, and it's also a pretty safe bet that everything Gene Roddenberry did with the first movie and its novelization was intentional, but beyond that, we can't really know. And that's kind of the point behind what I've been arguing in this video. It doesn't matter whether or not we know the intention. That's why more than an hour ago in this video, we discussed concepts like death of the author. In the end, some of it was likely intentional and some of it likely wasn't. But intention doesn't make a story, execution makes a story. If I say to you, no pun intended, right after I make a hilarious pun, the effect is still the same. It's still funny. If I say no offense before I insult you, the impact is still that you were offended. Intention counts for a piece of the puzzle, but execution is what outweighs it. Execution is what stays with us. This show and these movies are the final product that we have. This is what actually exists in the world for us to analyze. It's kind of cool when you think about it. So many other pieces of media are also still being debated as to what the true canon ending was. Shows like The Sopranos, for example, even books like George Orwell's 1984. People to this day are still debating those endings and what really happened. Well, since it's fiction, none of it really happened, and if you can argue that the literature supports your ending, then you're right. But speaking of 1984, let's talk about a movie that came out in actual 1984. The third movie, The Search for Spock, released in 1984, is where Kirk will have to put his devotion to the test. Spock is dead, but what if there's some way to bring Spock back? Would Kirk sacrifice everything for him? Kirk has shown us in the episode The City on the Edge of Forever that he is willing, albeit reluctant, to let a romantic interest of his die if it means that his ship, his crew, and society at large can be saved. It's a major hurdle for Kirk to sacrifice all of that just to save the life of the one person he loves. If he can finally do that, though, that means his arc has resolved. He's found the one. So this is all going to sound really weird if you haven't seen this movie, because this movie is actually just batshit insane. So bear with me, but watch the movie anyway. I really like it. I think it's my second favorite 1980s romance after When Harry Met Sally. So Spock died at the end of Wrath of Khan, but because Vulcans have mind powers and their souls are their own entities, he actually ended up transferring his soul into McCoy's body to preserve it. So McCoy's now carrying around Spock's soul inside his body, and that's going to kill him if he keeps it up forever. But having another soul in his body is making McCoy act weird, and then he ends up in prison, and in order for Spock to be out of purgatory, he must have his body and his spirit reunited so that they can lay him to rest. At this point, we don't even know for sure that Spock has any hope of coming back to life, just that he at the very least can have a peaceful and permanent death, but either way, Kirk is going to save him. Spock's dead body was launched into space after he died, but that body has regenerated. He's being reborn, but not being reborn as Spock. He's right now a child that's been reborn of Spock's DNA, and he's rapidly aging back into an adult Vulcan. He doesn't have Spock's consciousness or memories or spirit, none of that. He's more like a clone of Spock. So to get to the planet where Spock's child, rapidly growing into an adult clone, is living, Kirk must disobey Starfleet orders, steal the Enterprise, and in order to reunite Spock's body with his soul, he has to break McCoy out of jail. Sounds like Kirk is about to commit some court-martial level offenses, like he's about to risk his entire career for this. So Kirk steals the Enterprise, disobeying Starfleet orders and risking his entire Starfleet career. While on the Enterprise, some Klingons attack, because remember at this point Klingons are still Federation enemies. Kirk and his crew beam down off the Enterprise, but not until after Kirk begins its self-destruct sequence.
Computer, destruct sequence 1.
While on the planet's surface, the Enterprise explodes, and then the crew performs a ritual to reunite Spock's soul with his body. Spock's memories come back to him slowly, and the first thing he remembers is, of course, Captain Kirk, whom he calls by his nickname, Jim.
My father says that you have been my friend. You came back for me.
You would have done the same for me.
Why would you do this?
Because the needs of the one outweighed the needs of the many.
Jim. Your name is Jim.
Yes.
Back in Dagger of the Mind, this is how Star Trek defined being in love. Being willing to lie, cheat, steal, risk your career for someone. Kirk deceived his Starfleet superiors, directly disobeyed orders, literally stole the Enterprise, and then in a symbolic gesture of the path he'd chosen, as he is in the process of pursuing his true love, Spock, he watches his former love, the Enterprise, as it literally explodes. Kirk's character arc is now finally complete as well. Literary euphoria sets in. Kirk and Spock can then live happily ever after, going on adventures like time traveling to save some whales in the 1980s.
Let's go over the gay checklist really quick, shall we? 2 men, check. San Francisco, check. Rainbow, check. Yeah, that's the 3 pillars of gay right there. And then, a couple of weeks later, not kidding, I came across this other poster for the voyage home. Really? You take the rainbow from the first poster and the San Francisco from the second poster to create a poster offspring more flamboyant than Liberace in his glory days, and I'm supposed to think that this is like an innocent happenstance? Like, seriously? Look at it! They're getting beamed down by a goddamn rainbow!
Never getting married to anyone else? Like all historical examples of same-sex partnerships, they're probably gonna be buried next to each other. Okay, real quick, we just gotta look a little closer at the poster for the 4th movie, The Voyage Home, okay? Real quick. I just want us to understand what this poster looks like. You have 2 very stylish men being beamed down by a rainbow into 1980s San Francisco. Over here, we've got this George Michael looking dude. Over here, we've got like one of the Village People. This is the most aggressively Bert and Ernie coded movie poster I have ever seen in my entire life. And that is the resolution to the romantic subplot that slowly built throughout Star Trek over the course of 18 years. Isn't love a beautiful thing? Isn't it amazing how love can transcend human categorized concepts like time, space, gender, and more? Isn't it amazing the power that this emotion can have, the way it can change us, cause us to evolve, make us feel complete? It's also entirely possible that you heard me out in good faith for this entire video and walked away thinking, I still don't see it. And I guess that's okay. As I established, Star Trek unfortunately isn't real, and fictional universes, things that aren't real, by nature cannot have one true interpretation. I'd argue that claiming that there's one true interpretation would go against the entire spirit behind sharing stories with other humans in the first place. So if you and I still have different Star Trek opinions, we're still cool, I guess. In a way, we're kind of both right. While Star Trek may be fictional, though, the impact that it had on queer fans during the past 6 decades is very, very real. The groundwork it laid for the academic study of queer media analysis is also very real. And the analysis of a subtle, understated love story also says a lot about what it means to tell stories, what it means to interpret the fictional worlds we become immersed in, the ways our minds can treat fiction as something real enough for us to care so passionately about understanding and defending it. And at the end of the day, you can't spell subtext without butt sex. Live long and prosper, bitches!
It seems they're bisexual.
Brace yourselves. The area of penetration will no doubt be sensitive.
Push hard. Dig it in there, Mr.